such as becoming barbers, goldsmith, and ironsmith. And we still see that in Kingston today, like I said earlier on, with Jewelorama as being one of the popular jewelry places in town. But many didn't know that some of the best barbers back in the day were Chinese and Indians. And they also became money lenders. In the previous class, I told you about drop hand. The Chinese were famous for that, for introducing drop hand. It wasn't borrowing money, but it was actually the precursor to the lotto. Precursor meaning before the lotto existed, that also existed. And you find that in some towns and in some cities like Spanish Town, drop hand is still famous today. Drop hand is a game of chance where you choose a number. The number is known to you and it's known to the person who is controlling the game, and that person keeps that number for you with your name written beside it, but other people might come and purchase other numbers, and if that number is played, that's the winning number and you get all that bag of money. Still happens in Jamaica today. It's not legal under the Betting and Games and Lottery Commission, however, but it still happens in our country today. The Chinese and the East Indians, when they left the plantation, some of the East Indians took up jobs as making brass, silver, gold ornaments, which were indispensable to their lifestyle. And this influenced the Afro-Jamaicans. We can see that today still existing in our culture. You look at when Usain Bolt is about to do a race, he has his golden necklace around his neck. Most Jamaicans on the streets today, they'll have their necklace, their rings, their ornaments, everything, all influenced by these Indians. And they're well decorated, probably with a lion on it, some flowers, different decorations. Now, you look at how the East Indians set up shop. You have the Shatanis, you have the Chulanis, the Twani, the Matahani, the Swani, Vaswani. These are names which we say are synonymous to the manufacturing, the wholesale, retail, or the in-bond businesses. You check these jewelry stores downtown, uptown Kingston, in Montego Bay, or in Ocho Rios. They are predominantly controlled by East Indians. Now, the Chinese also set up shop. Mr. Chin had bakeries downtown Kingston and in Montego Bay. Most of the Chinese, at the end of their contract, established small enterprises or small businesses after they left the plantation. But these businesses grew and grew into large businesses today.
Extremely important that you take time to understand what is involved in making law. I say that our first and foremost duty is that of legislator, because the Constitution tells us that Parliament is empowered to pass laws for peace, order, and good government. For the Jamaican Constitution, it specifies peace, order, and good government of Jamaica. I know the Trinidadian Constitution specifies it similarly, except it's for the good government of Trinidad and Tobago. And the other constitutions that have a similar model as Jamaicans, I believe, all have the provision, the power of Parliament to make laws. But laws are made not just for any and everything, for peace, order, and good government. Now, if you look at what happens when there is dispute, you might get a better understanding of why discipline and diligence is required in the lawmaking process. Our courts in Jamaica have the authority to rule on the validity of an act of Parliament, and they also have the task of interpreting enacted laws in cases where the correct meaning of the act is in dispute. And our Constitution says that if any other law is inconsistent with the Constitution shall prevail, and the other law shall, to the extent of the inconsistency, be void. And this is subject to the amendment procedure in the Constitution set out at section 49. But before I go into what is involved in lawmaking at the pre-parliament stage, within Parliament and post-Parliament, I'd like to just tell you that in a worst-case scenario, after the laws have been passed and the courts are called in, the task of the court is often said to be to ascertain the intention of Parliament expressed in the language under consideration. This is correct, and it may be helpful so long as it is remembered that the intention of Parliament is an objective concept, not a subjective one. The phrase is a shorthand reference to the intention which the court reasonably imputes to Parliament in respect of language used. It is not the subjective intention of the minister or other persons who promoted the legislation, nor is it the subjective intention of the draftsman or of individual members or even a majority of individual members of either house. This is what was held by Lord Nichols in the case of Environmental Secretary ex parte Spathholm in 2001. It serves as a poignant reminder of the level of diligence and discipline that is required in the lawmaking process. Now, in seeking the meaning of the words used by Parliament, the courts employ established principles of interpretation as useful guides, and if necessary, also use internal aids found in the rest of the Act. So they will look at other provisions in the law to get a better understanding of what the law is seeking to do. The courts also use external aids, for example, material outside of the Act, to identify the mischief that the statute is intended to cure and the purpose of the legislation. The principles or presumptions of statutory interpretation are seldom conclusive and sometimes point in opposite directions. The task of the court in discovering the meaning or effect of words used by Parliament always requires analysis of the text of the legislation. If the policy or purpose of a statute can be determined, it may be possible to give an interpretation consistent with that. Now, there was formerly a rule that the court may not look to Hansard, and Hansard is a record of debates in Parliament, to discover the meaning of legislation, although limited use might be made of documents such as the report of commissions and parliamentary committees as an aid to identifying the mischief which the legislation was intended to remedy. In 1992, the House of Lords, which is the predecessor to the UK Supreme Court, and which sits on the same level as the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, modified that rule, and the rule is now that a court may use Hansard as an aid to statutory construction where the legislation is ambiguous or obscure and the material relied on consists of clear statements made by the minister or promoter of the bill. Why have I pointed this out? Again, is to emphasize the level of diligence and discipline that is required in the lawmaking process, and in particular, clear statements made by the minister or the promoter of the bill in the event of dispute. Certain presumptions of interpretation are of constitutional importance, and I'll give you one. It has often been presumed that Parliament does not intend to take away common law rights by implication as distinct by express words. And the courts have used these presumptions to develop the idea of common law constitutional rights, such as, for example, the right of access to a court, but that right may be abrogated by express words or necessary implication. Most principles of interpretation evolve from judicial decisions, but rules of interpretation may be imposed on the courts by Parliament, says the highest court. Now, the procedure found in the rules that determine how a bill proceeds through each house and require that it receives 3 readings in each house, as well as a stage at which the text may be scrutinized in detail and amended, is contained in the standing orders of the 2 houses. And the standing orders are regulations of the Constitution of Jamaica, pursuant to Section 51, subsection 1. For those who are not of the Jamaican jurisdiction online, I believe you may have similar provisions in your Constitution, and I would invite you to look there. So, Jamaican parliamentarians and all parliamentarians should familiarize themselves with a chapter of their Constitution which deals with Parliament. For the Constitution of Jamaica, it's Chapter 5, and in particular Part 2, which sets out the powers and procedures of Parliament. That spans sections 48 to section 62. Now to the meat of the matter. I look at pre-parliament procedure, what happens in Parliament, and what happens after Parliament. So the entire pre-Parliament process for making laws involve many, many stages, but I've condensed them with the guidance of the Chief Parliamentary Council into 7 main stages. The first has to do with approval of the annual legislation program. And those of you who pay attention to Parliament knows that when the parliamentary year has been open, the Governor-General gives a throne speech and the legislation program is set out. There is a whole set of process that is involved in the approval of the legislation program. The second of the 7 main stages is the approval of policy by Cabinet. Third, the issuance of drafting instructions. Fourth, preparation and circulation of bills. Fifth, approval of bills by the Legislation Committee of Cabinet. 6, approval of bills by Cabinet. 7, the introduction of the bill in Parliament. Just to say a little about this pre-Parliament stage, because what you see in Parliament is the tip of the iceberg. So every Parliament has sessions of Parliament. For us, ours begin around February, March. And it is essential that the program for a session be decided well in advance of the beginning of the session. Government is organized in ministries, and ministries have departments and agencies. All ministries are assigned subject matters, what you call their portfolio, and they have responsibility for the laws that are relevant to the subject matters. So ministries are required to prepare and forward to the Secretary of the Legislation Committee early in the year, and this should preferably happen around mid-January, a provisional legislation program for the ensuing session. In submitting the program, the ministry should set out the scope and purpose of each proposal, the ministry's idea as to whether it will require a bill of short, medium, or long length, the urgency of the matter in relation to the work of the ministry, and indicating by numerical sequence, where possible, its priority rating compared with other matters in the ministry. Fourthly, whether the proposals for legislation have been approved in principle by the Cabinet. Sixth, whether drafting instructions have been issued to the Chief Parliamentary Council, and where a draft bill has been produced, an indication as to whether the draft is in the process of being settled between the relevant ministry and the Office of the Parliamentary Council, or whether it is in circulation for comments prior to submission to the Legislation Committee. Then any other remarks which may enable the Legislation Committee to determine its priority rating in regard to the program as a whole. So there is a lot of work that has to be done in the ministries. And all who are wondering about the duties of ministers, make no mistake, the duties are heavy. A lot of members of the public don't know that because we don't spend the time explaining it, but a lot of work is done behind the scene. The Legislation Committee here in Jamaica is a committee of the Cabinet, and it reviews proposals put forward by ministries, consulting where necessary with the ministries concerned, and then they draft up the full legislation program, arranged on a priority basis according to the anticipated sittings of Parliament during the session. And the program has to be recommended for acceptance by the Cabinet. The program approved by Cabinet will be announced in Parliament early in the session, and that announcement usually comes in the throne speech. And thereafter, copies of the full program is sent by the Secretary of the Legislation Committee to all ministers, the Attorney General, the Financial Secretary, permanent secretaries of all ministry, the Chief Parliamentary Council, the Director General of the Planning Institute of Jamaica, the Director of Legal Reform, clerks, the clerk to the Houses of Parliament, and heads of department. So that is the preparation of the program. The next step, pre-parliament, step number 2, approval of policy by Cabinet. Now it is said that good laws make better laws, and bad laws make worse laws. The quality of the law is determined by the clarity of the policy underlying the law. The clarity of the law is also determined by the language used to express the policy intent. And that is why I began with the worst case scenario of a dispute and the court having to determine the intention of Parliament. So as soon as after the program, the legislation program is announced, ministries will proceed to prepare Cabinet submissions, if those have not yet been done, seeking approval for the drafting of the relevant bills. By constitutional convention, no proposal for substantive legislation, meaning acts of Parliament, are formally dealt with until approved by the Cabinet. Each submission should be preceded by an examination of the major issues involved, including the legal issues, and the Attorney General should, where necessary, be consulted, and if other ministries are affected, their views should be obtained. Additionally, submissions proposing substantive reforms to the law, meaning significant changes in legal principle or procedures, should be sent to the Legal Reform Department for examination and comment. The Chief Parliamentary Council should normally be consulted before the submission is put forward in order to ensure that the submission adequately covers the main principles which will form the basis for more detailed drafting instructions. I note the quiet in the room This is not the time when I will get you up in laughter, you know, because this is the serious, serious side of Parliament. And some people think that Parliament is just about the rowdy and the raucous and the banging of desks without understanding the attention to detail, the knowledge that is required on the technical side for the passing of laws. But it is not just on the technical side that attention is required. Parliamentarians themselves who are involved in the actual passing of the law have to learn to pay attention, have to find a way to be excited about the process. If your goal is to be a parliamentarian, and if you're already serving a parliamentarian, and especially after the restructured remuneration, I have to say that we have no excuse but to get with it. Now, when a cabinet decision for the preparation of legislation has been made, the cabinet secretary will cause a copy of the decision and the submission to be forwarded to the Attorney General and to the Chief Parliamentary Counsel for information. The Legal Reform Department is also given a copy with the substantive reform content. The third of the 7 pre-parliamentary stages, drafting instructions. Now, the ministry concerned will be responsible for giving the Chief Parliamentary Counsel drafting instructions. And during the drafting stage, the ministry also deals directly with the Chief Parliamentary Counsel. The instructions should be in accordance with established guidelines, and those guidelines are in writing and can be circulated. The relevant ministry file, or at a minimum, all relevant documents on the ministry file should be sent to the Chief Parliamentary Counsel with the drafting instructions. Where drafting instructions do not accord with the guidelines, the Chief Parliamentary Counsel will notify the ministry, and where appropriate, the Cabinet Office, that the matter will not proceed or be processed for drafting until and unless adequate instructions are supplied. The preparation of drafting instructions is actually a technical skills. If the drafting instructions are poorly done, I guarantee you that the legislation is going to be poorly prepared, and it is not the Parliamentary Council who has responsibility for that. It's a ministry, the parent ministry. So the drafting instructions, so it's the settlement of the program, approval by cabinet, preparation of the drafting instructions, preparation and issuance, and then we move fourthly to the preparation of the bills and circulation of them. It is a Chief Parliamentary Counsel who has responsibility for drafting legislation. She, of course, may delegate to her staff, and the delegation to junior staff depends on the complexity of the law being passed and actually where in the hierarchy of legislation the law is. So we know at the very top of the hierarchy we have the Constitution, which is the supreme law, then we have Acts of Parliament, and we have regulations. And regulations take any of many forms, including what is referred to as actual regulations. There may be orders which may require the approval of Parliament, or Parliament may delegate entirely to the authority the power to make the regulations. They then have to be gazetted for them to have the effect of law. You have notices and rules, etc., right down the line. For those who are particularly interested, you can look in the Interpretation Act for the meaning of law and regulations. So it is a duty of the Parliamentary Council to prepare the bill in accordance with the Cabinet decision, and the bill has also to be done in a way that will enable the minister to recommend the bill to the Legislation Committee for introduction to Parliament. Where a bill amends existing legislation, it will have what we call left-hand pages appended, and these are a reproduction of the provisions being amended. So you may not have ever noticed it for the parliamentarians, but next time, in fact, the bill to amend the Child Care and Protection Act, the repeal of Section 49, if you look to the back, you will see the left-hand pages setting out the provision that is to be repealed. And as soon as the bill is finally settled between the Chief Parliamentary Council and the ministry concerned, the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry is to arrange for copies of the bill to be prepared for circulation to all ministries and departments. The relevant parliamentary committees, the Attorney General, the Legal Reform Department, where law reform is involved, inviting comments to be made within a specified period, and that really shouldn't exceed 2 weeks. If for any reason the ministry intends to circulate copies in typescript, the ministry will be responsible for supplying the requisite number of copies. Madam Clerk, I have been thinking about recommending a change to this to close the gaps between the slippage. I think we may have to look at centralizing aspects of the lawmaking process, because there is a lot of delay that takes place, and unfortunately sometimes the urgent attention is not given to the legislative matters because ministries have to deal with so many other things. And then many times the ministers themselves are not notified because it's the technical staff that is responsible. And it is only when the news picks up a matter of excitement that everyone starts to scramble and backpedal to find out what really is happening in the, in the shop. So the Attorney General is to have the relevant files of the ministry, and it's really important because very often, especially in litigation, we have to look back on the files, look at the policy, look at the documents in order to provide appropriate guidance to the court. The ministry should not proceed to submit a bill to the Legislation Committee unless the Attorney General has indicated that a bill is in order. All right, so we then move to consideration of the bill by the Legislation Committee, and we don't even get to Parliament yet. All right, so all of you who think that what you see on the floor of Parliament just happens like that, think again. Think again. After the Chief Parliament Council releases copies of the bill for submission to the Legislation Committee, a submission has to be prepared in respect of the bill by the ministry concerned, recommending, asking the committee to recommend to the Cabinet that the bill be approved for introduction in the House of Parliament. And the submission is to set out the purpose of the bill, when Cabinet approval was given in principle and when drafting instructions were issued, whether the bill was circulated to other ministries for comments, references to all unresolved points. The Permanent Secretary or other responsible officer of the ministry in charge of the bill should, as a matter of course, attend the meeting of the Legislation Committee when the bill is being considered. And so should the minister, if the minister is not a member of the committee. And the bill is reviewed in details, clause by clause, against the policy. And after the committee signs off on it, on receipt of the matter is sent back to the Cabinet. So on receipt of the recommendation of the Legislation Committee, the ministry proceeds to prepare a Cabinet submission seeking for approval of the bill as passed by the Legislation Committee to be introduced in Parliament. And then now we get to the introduction. When the bill is approved by Cabinet, the Cabinet Secretary sends the relevant Cabinet decision to the Secretary of the Legislation Committee, to the relevant portfolio ministry, and the Chief Parliamentary Council, the Attorney General, the Law Reform Department, and then a copy of the bill is forwarded under memorandum by the Chief Parliamentary Council to the government printers for it to be printed and returned for proofreading before the final copies are printed and laid on the table of the House or the Senate, as the case may be. And there is a rule as to how the law is to be printed, the format of it. And if it is not printed in the form, the bill cannot move to debate. So you hear of the long form and then you hear of the short form. The system is rules-based, and there is good reason for that. Now, the clerk to the House submits to the Cabinet Office on a quarterly basis a status report on the progress of bills. Parliamentary Council will attend the House, the Senate, whenever the presence is required, and the Ministry will be informed of the matter. Now, can you imagine? You get tired yet, and we don't even get to Parliament. We don't even get to Parliament. So, if you ever see me being annoyed in any of the sittings, especially in the joint select committee sittings, when presentations are made which do not reflect thought and rigor, and in particular which comes with inaccuracies in law, it is because of the kind of work that goes into preparing a bill before it comes. And I believe it is entirely reasonable to expect, especially from lawyers, that if they're coming before the Parliament to make presentation of bills, that they would at least pay attention to detail and accuracy. You see, the call for parliamentarians to be deliberate and accurate and to perform at a certain level is equally required of anyone who's coming before the Parliament to make a presentation. Standards matter. No. And of course, I have to say, I am unapologetic about it. People have labeled me as being miserable and otherwise. But you see, it's because I am the only parliamentarian that has had the burden of interpreting the laws, having sat for almost a decade as a judge. And so, for me, it's not just an exercise in formality. At the end of the day, the laws are used in real ways that affect people's lives in real ways. All right? Now, in cases where proposals for urgent legislation arise after the legislation program has been settled, the ministry concerned should prepare a cabinet submission seeking approval in principle for the proposed legislation and also for its inclusion in the program for the current year. And they must give sound reason why they should be allowed to skip the queue and take things out of line. Now, that note is really for the ministers in the House, and I wonder how many are in the House. I'm not picking on you, Minister Grange, because I know you have a lot of work that you're doing on the gender front, and I know you get passionate when matters arise in the society, which you would not have contemplated when your legislation program is being settled for your ministry. And we see it all the time. I'm just saying that even when you go through the detailed process of preparing your program, matters will arise, as they do often arise in the Jamaican society, and I believe in the other jurisdictions for members who are online, that require urgent legislative action. And then they will bounce out other matters. But that really deals with the out of Parliament side. Now, when we get to Parliament, the rules for dealing with bills and passing of law, they are contained in the Constitution itself and also in the standing orders. And as I said earlier, the standing orders of each House of Parliament are regulations of the Constitution pursuant to Section 51, subsection 1. So they are not just ordinary rules. They are not just rules that are made up by parliamentarians for their convenience. And the Constitution, in fact, specifies and delegates to the Parliament the power to deal with matters of its own privilege and immunity and to regulate its own proceedings. So we have first reading of the bill, and that is when it is introduced in Parliament, laid on the table. And you would normally hear the clerk tell you that a bill is read a first time. There isn't much formality. What has developed over time, if there is no intention to open the debate immediately, because there is a time that is specified between the introduction of the bill and the commencement of debate on the whole text of the bill. Ministers sometimes make a ministerial statement to give an indication of what is contained in the bill. But generally, the first reading of the bill is a mere formality, and time is allowed for all parliamentarians to read the bill, familiarize themselves with it. And reading the bill is extremely important because it is the words used by Parliament that determines the intention of Parliament. That is why I began with that. Then you move to a second reading of the bill, where you have a commencement of debate on the bill. Sometimes, before the debate is commenced, the bill is referred to a select committee that sits jointly with the other house, and the matters are deliberated on. Not every bill has to be referred to a joint select committee, but I have to say that I will continue to press for changes to the rules and to the regulations. I do believe that parliamentarians can become far more involved in the lawmaking process if we were to divide up the ministries and the subject matters into subject areas, similarly to how it's done for the sectoral debate, and have members indicate their areas of interest. Madam Minister, as Deputy Leader of the House, this is something that you may want to consider alongside with the House Leader, and those who are online may make similar proposals to their leaders in the houses. It may spark a lot more interest, and people may serve a little more and be enthusiastic, and also allow parliamentarians an opportunity to connect a little more closely with the people and get down to the real objective of passing laws, so that we can get the peace and the, yes, order and good government in the society. I have been, well, Minister Grange herself is quite revolutionary, you know. You might not hear everything that she speaks about, but a lot is being discussed. I mean, the sittings of the House can also be arranged to allow for a better balance to be struck between the parliamentary work and the constituency work. Because it's when you go to your constituency that you get a good idea of the issues on the minds of the people. And then you can determine whether the decisions being taken in the Parliament by way of policy or laws are really in touch with the real needs of the people. So I have also been, and I know the Minister shares the view, a strong advocate for us to look at perhaps a parliamentary week, and then you have a week off where you can go. It also allows you time to pause and to assess and reflect on the issues that are raised with you in the constituencies and for the senators in the wider society. And then for us to come back and deliberate. And that is why the job description put forward by Prime Minister Holness specifies a certain level of deliberativeness in the proceedings of the House. So I may seem like I'm suggesting it, but believe me, it's already thought out. And when you come to look at the job description, you will see it reflected there. Well, you should see it. The job description has already been made public and will be reflected on and deliberated on. But that part of it is taking into account this aspect of the work. So then, so when you go to joint select, it's almost as if it's a committee of the House, and you have clause by clause review. You take submissions from persons outside of the Parliament, and you consider those submissions. Some of them may make recommendations. They may question the bill. I know it has become fashionable to allege everything to be unconstitutional without any display. It is fashionable in sections of the public to make quick allegations that matters are unconstitutional. But the truth is that the Constitution itself sets out the standard of derogation, and then the courts have decided what you go through in assessing the constitutionality of any piece of legislation. Thankfully, the Privy Council has clarified that not everything that applies in other jurisdictions is applicable in Jamaica, something we would know. But unfortunately, sometimes our courts adopt precedent without making the necessary distinction. But we now have very good guidance on how to assess the constitutionality of provisions having regard to the standard of derogation that is provided for. It may sound like big language, but it's as demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. That is the standard of derogation, and it has a staged analysis beginning with your justificatory criterion, what it is that you're seeking to do, what is the process by which you're doing it, and the courts have set it out quite clearly. So if the bill goes to Joint Select Committee, then it is reviewed there, and at the end of the day, a report is prepared. The intention is to shorten the deliberations in the House, because the House would be guided by the deliberations of the committee, and so you can expect or should expect a shorter process of debate when the report goes from the committee to Parliament. If the bill is not referred to a Joint Select Committee, then you have full-blown debate on it. May I just encourage parliamentarians here, if you are not yet in the habit, please look on the text of the bill. You don't have to be a lawyer. And if you're not a lawyer and you'd like some guidance, please seek it, especially now that we're having a closer collaboration across the aisles among women. The men seem to be able to take care of themselves. I'm happy to hear. Yes. No. Generally, I must say that when the debate proceeds on the text of the bill, you usually get a better debate. What I find challenging is when a subject matter of the bill is used to go at large, and all kinds of extraneous matters are brought in, and at the end of the day, attention is not being paid to what you are legislating to see whether it will have the intended effect. So then you go through, after you go into committee stage, and at committee stage you can propose amendments, and then there is a report back that the bill has passed committee stage with X number of amendments or with no amendments. And then it moves to third reading and it is passed. And then you go through the process all over again in the next House. After that is done, Senator Allen, for those of us who have had the privilege of sitting in both houses, let me just say that when you are in the Senate, you believe that the Senate is the place. But when you get to the House, then you realize the House is where the real excitement is. You know, in the Senate, you have to make up for not being an elected representative. And so, you know, there are all kinds of creative things that are done. The Senate is interesting. I had fun for the 2 terms that I sat there. No, however, I do believe that there is a proper place. This is my personal view, and I don't want anyone to misquote me because we are in the process of constitutional reform. My view, Sing Anita, since you say you are tape me, you know the place that I have experienced the greatest meanness is from women in politics? Personally. Don't clap it. The place where I have experienced the greatest meanness. Yes. That's why you're clapping? I see. It's unfortunate, eh? We must resolve among ourselves that we do not need to go there. We can defend our differences politically, and we can compete without being derogatory of each other and being disingenuous. And it is my hope that if nothing else comes out of this process, we will learn to be kinder to each other, notwithstanding how fiercely we compete. So, after it's passed in both houses, Then if amendments are made, the bill has to be printed in proper form with the amendments. The bill is sent for check, and it's checked by the Attorney General in particular, also checked by the Chief Parliamentary Council, but the Attorney General checks it for consistency with the Constitution and issues a certificate of constitutionality, and then it goes to the Governor General. The Parliament sends the bill over after it is passed and printed in proper form to the chambers. The chambers' review is done, and a certificate is prepared, signed by the Attorney General, goes back to the Parliament, and the Parliament sends it to the Governor General for assent. Now, assent is a formal process, and it is set out at section 60 of the Constitution. The bill, it says that a bill shall not become law until the Governor General has assented to it in His Majesty's name and on His Majesty's behalf, and has signed it in token of such assent. And it tells you it cannot go to the Governor General for assent until it has been passed through both houses. There are a number of other detailed rules that I will not go into, because I know time is of the essence and you may have some question. So after that, now the last thing, once the Governor General gives assent, it becomes law on the statute books, but it may not be in effect. So the law has to be gazetted, and there are different processes by which a law may come into effect. Some require an appointed day notice, and that is done by the minister who piloted the bill, and that is also gazetted. And different sections may come into effect at different time if the Act itself provides for it. And then voila, you then have to deal with implementation and enforcement. Another part of the process, which I hope parliamentarians will scrutinize, very little attention has been paid to it so far, certainly from my research and assessment. We must start looking at what is required to properly implement and enforce our legislation, and those questions should be asked in the Parliament from day one. I don't believe we should have laws on the statute books that we're not using. When you don't enforce a law, the non-enforcement becomes a subculture. And when you start enforcing it, it creates all kind of problem. And then people tell you that they never know that this law exists. We have had recent examples of it. So, ladies and gentlemen, public education is a must. Isn't it wonderful that all our parliamentary proceedings are now televised? Isn't it wonderful that even presentations like these will be archived and can be looked at again? So the public education takes many forms. It takes many forms, and people have a responsibility to tune in and pay attention. I think we may have to get to the stage where we publicize what is going to be debated, not just within the Parliament, but more widely. It's work in progress, but I think we have made good progress, and I hope that we will improve a lot more. So, ladies and gentlemen, we pass laws for peace, order, and good government. The laws that we pass depend on the text of the law, and the text of the law is informed by the policy, and the policy has to be clearly and coherently thought out. And then now we are all bound by the laws, and Lord knows we need to move from rampant lawlessness to lawfulness. I hope a little bit of my own passion, notwithstanding that I didn't get excited and jump up and down, but the law has a calling. It serves not only the individual, but the society. And so we have to balance individual rights with the collective rights and live together in peace and orderly and ensure that we have good government. I thank you.
We thank the Minister for her very fulsome presentation. I am sure that it has been very useful to those who are parliamentarians and those who will become parliamentarians. Last week, the Speaker reminded us that we all need to pay attention to the laws which we pass. And I know that with women who are dedicated to the task, this will happen. The next session, therefore, becomes particularly relevant because it speaks to making the legislative process gender responsive. And we have 3 panelists who will be discussing the matter with you. Now, 2 of our panelists will be joining us online. We are a little bit behind time, and so I am going to ask the panelists to be as succinct as possible in communicating with you, and to leave some time for the persons who are here to seek clarification or ask questions. So, Ms. Tony Broadbent is our first presenter. She is a representative of the UN Women Multi-Country Office of the Caribbean. All her work has been in the area of gender. And so she was a team leader for the Advancing Gender Justice in the Pacific program, again with the UN Women. She has served as gender specialist for the United Nations Development Program in South Africa. And she has also lectured in international relations and development studies at Yanshan University in China, and has directed and co-produced a film on Haiti. She will be followed by Ms. Benita de Bateza. And Ms. de Bateza joined the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association in 2017. She is currently the lead coordinator of the CPA, Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians Network. This will be particularly relevant to us in Jamaica now, since our Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act has been implemented, because she has published a CPA Anti-Harassment Policy Guidelines, a toolkit for Commonwealth parliamentarians. She has a very impressive resume in that area, and as time goes by, you will get to know her better. Mrs. Sharon Coburn Robinson is, of course, no stranger to us. She is the Principal Director for Gender Affairs in the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport, and she is integral to the implementation of the National Policy for Gender Equality, as well as coordinating the qualitative dimensions of social policy and action research. She describes herself as goal-oriented, success-driven, and highly motivated as a professional with an immense passion for social policy, developmental research and action, advocacy, and sustainable development, and so say all of us. So this is how we are going to proceed. I will not say anything further. Ms. Tony Broadbent will make her presentation. She will be followed by Ms. de Bateza and then Mrs. Coburn. At the end of that, I will guide the proceedings further. So I ask that Ms. Tony Broadbent, I welcome you. Is Ms.
Thank
Broadbent?
you very much.
Thank you.
Good to see you. And I just want, Madam Chair, I just want to be clear, how many minutes would you like us to be so that we cut down? Because I can cut down and get to the point very easily.
I will rely on you, from my knowledge of you, your expertise, that you'll recognize from the program that we are way behind, and you will use your good judgment.
All right. I will not go longer than 5 minutes then. It's a pleasure to be here, ministers. I see ministers, the speaker from Belize online. Great to see you. I see Minister Grange in the room. I see many other colleagues online. I see the minister from St. Lucia. It's wonderful to have you in this way. And thank you so much for asking me to be a part of the panel. The first place I'll start off, I had a few PowerPoint slides and I'll get to them quickly, but the first place I'll start off is the questions we need to ask ourselves in terms of considering what is required for gender responsive legislation. And Minister Malgu-Fort was right. Minister Grange has been an incredible advocate for gender equality and women's empowerment over the years. And because this gender thing is in everything. The question though, the first one is there existing political will, both within the parliament and within the government, and this comes from the president, the prime minister, and other ministers, to drive gender responsive law reform? And if not, what needs to be done to have that? In some cases across the world, parliamentarians start caucuses so that that will is drummed up within parliament. Civil society colleagues often work collaboratively with Parliament, not in a call-out way, not in a fractious way, but collaboratively as allies to work together to encourage action on gender-responsive legislation where it's required. Generally, the focus is on violence against women and girls because that is most obviously the life and death issue. However, gender-responsive legislation as it pertains to social protection, this would mean parental leave, whether it's paternity leave, extended maternity leave, responsive childcare in terms of state-supported childcare, if that's the case, are also critical aspects of the work around gender-responsive law reform. The other issue is whether there are internal mechanisms and expertise within Parliament to advance gender equality in the law. Now, many of our parliaments in the Caribbean don't necessarily have, like Chile was able to hire a gender specialist to advise their parliament when it came to gender legislative reform on violence against women and girls. That is not necessarily available to all parliaments. But where can you get the support and the expertise to advance these issues? And would it be useful to start by taking a gender self-assessment of the parliament, so an audit of sorts, to identify where it could be more effective to ensure that all aspects of parliamentary work are gender responsive, including lawmakers. Now, if this is the case, contacting IPU, the International Parliamentary Union, for assistance is one key way in which you can get support to do this. And of course, UN Women can support in terms of the technical advice. But when it comes to gender responsive legislation, we are not starting from scratch. And that's the important thing to remember. One, the first thing is we have to get the definitions correct. As Minister Malhufwat spoke to earlier, we need to know not only what the legislations are at the international level, but what it means at the national legislative level. When we talk about discrimination, what is it that it means? How is it defined in the Constitution in each jurisdiction? Because while all countries have ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, most countries in the Caribbean do not have definitions as advised by the Committee on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in their constitutions. This is something that might require constitutional reform or legislative reform as it pertains to the definition of gender equality, the definition of gender, and the definition of discrimination. We can also look to the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically some of the key targets when it speaks to gender equality, discrimination, and the law. While Goal 5 speaks specifically to gender equality, all of the different goals recognize gender equality indicators and targets, specifically in this case, Goal 10, which is around reducing inequalities, and Goal 16, which is on promoting just and peaceful as well as inclusive societies. And I won't go into all of these. I'll make sure the presentation is shared so that you can see some of the key targets and then measure whether what is in the legislation in your jurisdiction matches these targets. Many of your countries are reporting on voluntary national reports to the General Assembly as we are at the midway point for the Sustainable Development Goals. The step-by-step approach, we've gone through the legislative approach, but if we're being as gender responsive as possible, we do need to ensure the accountability of all parliamentarians. And it is fantastic that Jamaica is leading the way with a parliamentary caucus. We have a parliamentary caucus as well in Belize and St. Lucia and Antigua and Barbuda that looks specifically at gender equality and women's empowerment. But men should be as accountable on this as women are and as members on these caucuses are as well. All parliamentarians are. Making sure that the public understands lawmaking. Now, while many of the parliamentary sessions in some countries may be televised, do they understand the proceedings? Are they watching the proceedings? Are we using the different media that young people in particular are using? Because many people don't know what the law is in their country, and many people are quoting US law based on Hollywood's proliferation of an understanding of what their constitutional rights are, which are not their constitutional rights. For example, people pleading the fifth, which is something we have consistently heard when we have cases of gender-based violence. Identifying the laws that may need to be enacted or amended is something that is critical, and you can use the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. You can use those SDG targets to identify which laws may need to be amended or enacted. There is also a CEDAW legislative indicator framework that is available from UN Women that you can use for this. But the speaker before me, Minister, went through the drafting and enacting of legislation. After that, we need the budgeting for it, because the implementation does not happen without budgeting for gender responsive laws. And this is a critical policy for gender markers. And in Grenada, they have pioneered this within our region. It is a good practice that should be really adopted across the board, as well as the overseeing of the different implementation with regards to the bills that have been prioritized. We know who the key stakeholders are. We went through that. The different entry points for public participation, the ways in which we get to gender responsive law reforms. But these are some of the global priorities, and I'll finish here, that have been identified around what gender responsive law reform looks like. What needs to be repealed, what should be amended, what should be enacted. When it comes to repeal, this is something that is interestingly a sore topic across the Caribbean in many jurisdictions. Marriage is an exception to rape. Looking as well at the defensive against violent acts, honor killings, provocation, voluntary intoxication, not really as relevant for the Caribbean, that marriage as an exception to rape laws is. Laws prohibiting women from working in certain jobs, laws requiring women to obey their husbands, restrictions on women's freedom of movement, and also restrictions on women's access to reproductive health services. Culturally relevant, life-saving reproductive health services. What we look in terms of needing to be amended, and these are global, this comes from a publication that has been completed by IPU and UN Women on gender responsive legislation, an assessment across the globe as to the general laws that need to be repealed, amended, and enacted. Amended is the age of marriage for women and for girls and boys. And this is something that has been amended in the Caribbean, and we're doing well. But the age of consent is something that also needs to be addressed for both girls and boys. Unequal laws on divorce and custody. Property laws, we don't have too many of those issues here in the Caribbean, but unequal citizenship laws still is an issue in the Caribbean, as well as unequal access to finance. Enacting comprehensive gender equality legislation, comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation, looking at comprehensive family protection as it pertains especially to sexual and gender-based violence laws, sexual harassment protections. Congratulations to Jamaica. On the past week, as I know and I'm seeing on all social media, people talking about what this means for them and why it is important for them. Sex trafficking prohibition, laws to address the gender pay gap, parental leave entitlements, and again, this issue of time use and child care entitlements when it comes to the potential for universal childcare. So I'll leave it there and hand over to the next person on the panel, and they will be able to share the presentation, and I will stay on as long as I can to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, it's a pleasure to be able to join you all. It's a shame I'm not there in person. I'm here in London. The weather's not that bad, but I'm envious of the sun that you are all experiencing in the Caribbean. Again, I just would like to thank the Madam Speaker, the CWP Chairperson, Honourable Speaker Woods, for taking the opportunity to both invite me, but also would just like to congratulate the CWP CAA region for hosting this very, very, very important conference. So for purposes of time, I will try and be brief also, and will skip certain parts of my presentation. But I guess to begin, the topic that I've been asked to speak on is on gender sensitizing parliaments. And again, that's very linked to all the discussions we've had so far with respect to, the legislative process, women parliamentary caucuses, and just having gender responsive policies. And I guess the question is that you could start is why gender sensitized parliaments? So as mentioned before, there is a huge gender gap in terms of representation. That is still a huge issue that's affecting many parliaments in the Commonwealth where women are significantly underrepresented. Again, as mentioned by the previous speaker and by other participants during the course of the conference, issues of bullying and harassment have been huge and impacting both members of parliament, male and female, but also parliamentary staff. And also there is a lack of expertise or gendered expertise in parliaments as well. So having a parliaments embarking on a gender sensitizing self-assessment, as was mentioned, also known as an audit, is a way in which parliaments can establish mechanisms and processes to ensure that they have policies in place, but also are just operating in a way where they are transforming and respecting gender sensitive policies, international policies, but also making sure that they too are a reflection of what organizations and civil society members should be able to do. So I'm going to just briefly share my presentation, if you bear with me. And I will just jump into giving just a brief history on the CPA's work so far on gender sensitizing parliament. Okay, great. So the CPA's work on gender sensitizing parliament actually began back in 2001, where CWP, in fact, commissioned a study group that gathered to examine conventions and the language used in standing orders to see how those languages possibly affect the behaviour and attitudes towards women, but also other aspects of parliamentary life that would impact women and also alienate them from participating in the parliamentary process. So as part of that study group, there was a report that was drafted, I believe by the region's very own clerk, Ms. Jackie Sampson-Miguel. And the report identified strategies and mechanisms needed that Commonwealth Parliaments needed to make as soon as possible. But importantly, it also recognised that despite some expectations, the voices speaking out for women's rights were the voices of women, members of Parliament. And the members of the study group universally agreed that better cooperation between women and men is essential in any attempt at gender sensitizing parliaments and removing all barriers that may inhibit the fullest participation of women. So moving on to 2020, which is again years on, the CPA then built on the work of the report and launched its CWP Gender Sensitizing Parliament Guidelines, a standard and checklist for parliamentary change. So again, still acknowledging that despite 20 years after the drafting of that report, that there were still women, well, the case was that in Commonwealth parliaments, that women were still significantly underrepresented in parliament. Although there was an improvement, there was still, again, a gap. And I think at this point, I think it's just important to just share a few figures that we gathered at the CPA. So according to data gathered in 2022, only 45 parliaments out of the CPA's 180 branches have reached the Commonwealth Heads of Government target of having at least 30% women represented in Commonwealth parliaments. So again, just to reiterate, that's only 45 parliaments out of 180 have met the target of having 30% representation of women in parliament. And bringing this back to the region, out of those 45, only 4 parliaments in the CAA region have met that target of 30%. So that is an improvement from 2001. But again, as you can see, there's still quite a lot of work that needs to be done. And on the contrary, the data that we gathered at the CPA revealed also that 24 parliaments amongst the CPA membership still have under 5% of female representation in parliament. And of those 24, 11 parliaments still had 0 women elected in parliament. So again, that's a clear example that shows that Commonwealth parliaments are still failing to deliver on the equality of representation in parliament. So in a nutshell, the CPA's guidelines was therefore created to design to help parliaments and provide them with a set of standards that they need to work towards creating conditions that will help them reach the goals of becoming more representative and inclusive, and help Parliament identify actors and means through which reforms can be implemented. So the CPA defines a gender-sensitive Parliament as a place that responds to the needs and interests of women in its structures, operations, methods, and work, and is a place that removes barriers to women's full equal participation. So the guidelines start from the premise that, as mentioned before, that all Commonwealth Parliaments should at some point undertake a gender-sensitive audit, which is what we call a gender-sensitive self-assessment, as soon as possible to establish an initial benchmark of where they are on their gender-sensitive journey. So in the guidelines, we establish this benchmark by dividing standards according to what we call the CPA's 4 dimensions of a gender-sensitive Parliament. So dimension 1 looks at the equality of participation, or the equality of participation of women in Parliament. So this standard again concerns or focuses on diversity and representation. So that's, of course, like I mentioned, the number of women in parliaments, trying to ensure that Commonwealth parliaments exceed that target of 30%. It also looks at women in positions of leadership, so in roles, presiding officers' roles, but also being chairs of committees. It also looks at equal participation of in committee activities. So in terms of the work that we've been doing so far, we delivered the CPA's first gender-sensitive self-assessment last year, and we're continuing to do some this year and in the near future. And in one of the self-assessments that we did, it was noticed that through the review of committee structures and processes, that the Parliament did have a committee that was a single-sex committee, a committee of all men. And I do not have to explain why that will be an issue. But the Parliament didn't realise that that was an issue until the committee, which so happened to be a committee that focused on health, was responsible for undertaking an inquiry that focused on abortion rights and period products. And as I'm all sure that you're aware, that if that is a committee of men, the perspective of, and without the perspective of women, the committee inquiry, of course, would just shows that there was a lack of representation, but also insight that women parliamentarians could have contributed to ensure that the outcomes of the committee are those that lead to a policy that is not gender insensitive. So dimension 1 looks, as I mentioned, at the quality of participation, but also the makeup of Parliament to ensure that it's reflective of civil society. Dimension 2 concerns parliamentary infrastructure. So that's about the practices, the norms and procedures, which is critical. So that looks at, as mentioned, parental leave and ensuring that both male and female members are also entitled to parental leave. It looks at proxy voting, facilities such as baby changing rooms and feeding rooms to enable those members who have children to be able to bring them into their working environment and they have a safe space for them to feed their children. Dimension 3 looks at parliamentary culture. So this acknowledges that written rules don't necessarily tell the full story of what's going on in parliaments. And there's essentially a lot of informal rules and practices that are entrenched in the culture of parliament that impact the gender sensitivity of parliament, but also the experiences of both members and staff. So these standards look at issues around the code of conduct. A huge issue around Commonwealth Parliament is on bullying and harassment. And I think the IPU's releases data, and there's loads of studies that have been happening in Australia as well, looking into the experience of both male and female members and staff. And there's quite alarming accounts of the experiences that of bullying and harassment that people go through. So that looks at parliamentary culture as well, and asks questions such as, does the Parliament, or is Parliament recognised and truly representative, transparent and accessible and an effective institution? And dimension 4 looks at gender equality policy, but also women's substantive representation. So that's looking beyond having women in Parliament, but more about embedding gender sensitivity and mainstreaming it in all the works of Parliament. So that looks at how Parliament scrutinises policies. Are there women's caucuses in place or gender committees that will apply that gender lens to the work that Parliament is doing? Is gender budgeting and analysis a skill that both staff and parliamentarians have? As mentioned before, about ensuring that there are provisions that parliaments can have to tap into gender expertise when they're conducting their work, so they can always bring that gendered angle and analysis to discussions. It looks at parliaments having relevant links with civil society organisations, relevant gendered civil society organisations, to ensure that the voices of those underrepresented groups are being heard and brought to the table. And also looking at the remit of committees as well more broadly to see if gender is a cross-cutting theme. And as mentioned previously, the CPA is of the premise that all parliaments should undertake a gender-sensitive self-assessment as soon as possible so they can establish and identify where they are at on their gender-sensitive journey. And to complement the 2020 guidelines, the CPA produced the 2022 field guide, which in a nutshell is an accompanying document that has 7 steps that parliaments can take to conduct their very own self-assessment. So as mentioned before, the CPA has begun the process of delivering these self-assessments to parliaments, but the field guide is also written in a manner that parliaments themselves can simply do the self-assessments themselves if they're unable to secure a date with the CPA. So on the screen, I've just briefly identified the 7 steps of undertaking a gender-sensitive self-assessment. So the first one, again, is step 1, which is understanding what gender sensitivity is. And in a nutshell, that's like parliamentary staff, and members of parliament attending sessions like this to understand why a gender-sensitive parliament is important and various ways that the parliaments can take to ensure that they're being assessed, and also understanding what the CPA standards and checklists are. The second step, of course, is embracing a gender-sensitive parliament's principles. So before undertaking a self-assessment, it's essential that there is a formal agreement to undertaking a gender-sensitive review, but also equally important is that there must be political will to undertake a gender-sensitive review, which is critical in order to see transformative reform in Parliament. And step 3 looks at preparing a strategy. So this looks at issues such as the scope. So who will the gender sensitive parliament focus on? The unique thing about the CPA's gender sensitizing parliament field guide and guideline is that you can tailor it to the needs of your parliament. Would you want the review to simply focus on members of staff, or that be inclusive to parliamentary staff? Which methods would you like to take place? Will interviews be conducted? Will those be in person? Will those be virtual? The team that will be doing this, will that be led by the parliament, or will the parliament require the support of the CPA to be able to deliver this self-assessment for them? And also looks at questions about capacity. Is the parliament ready? Do they need to second another parliamentary staff, or release an advert to hire someone that's able to do this? But a part of that process as well, the parliament should also ask questions such as, who in the parliament has a formal authority to agree to a gender-sensitive self-assessment? Where would funding be allocated to support this work? And also, is there any other opposition? Are there any members of parliament or even members from civil society who may oppose to the parliament having a gender-sensitive assessment? Whilst we all know that gender equality and advancing the rights of women is important, I'm afraid there are still some people who believe the contrary. So does the parliament, or do members recognise who these people who may have opposing views are? And if so, what plans need to be put in place to ensure that they do not hinder the work the parliament wants to do? And then finally, the timeline of the work. So that's discussions about how long do you think the assessment is going to take, taking into consideration the parliamentary schedule, and when an ideal time to conduct the self-assessment will take, but also looking at the reporting and who will do that, and so on and so forth. Step 4, again, is performing initial diagnostics. So it involves developing a checklist consistent to the 4 dimensions and identifying who can provide you those information. So the question I asked about who has authority, just making sure that the checklist is all fully answered, and the checklist is available on the CPA's gender sensitizing field guides. And I'm sure there is a link that was shared, and I'm happy to share it again, where there's the full details of the checklist, but for the purposes of time, I'm not going to go through every single question that the checklist asks Parliament to go through. But step 5, again, is about preparing the review and collecting data. And I wish to reiterate that this is probably the most, well, all the other stages are important, but this is probably the most crucial stage of the self-assessment, as without data, you are unable to see where the Parliament was in the past and where it currently is at now. So this stage includes conducting surveys and interviews, but gathering data such as the standing orders, looking at the codes of conduct, any policies that the Parliament may have, the Parliament may have to kind of feed into the picture that we're hoping to create on where the Parliament is at on this gender-sensitive journey. And the step 6, again, is the reporting of the findings. So this involves whoever is conducting the self-assessment, be it the CPA or respective colleagues in the Parliament, analysing the data that is gathered from the interviews, from the documents they've read and the surveys to produce a report with recommendations that reflect the information collected, as I mentioned. And as part of the recommendations, they're supposed to be what we call specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound, specific and targeted with the names of who is supposed to lead on these recommendations. That it's clear that when the report is given to the Parliament, people in positions of authority are able to identify who exactly is responsible for enacting the recommendations and hopefully going about creating change. And the final step is the monitoring progress, which goes to show that, again, the work of becoming a gender-sensitive Parliament or going on the process of delivering a self-assessment is just not a one-time only thing. It requires constant and continuous monitoring and evaluation. So when the assessment is done or when the report is done, this is just to ensure that there is someone in Parliament that is regularly collecting data and monitoring the processes and how the Parliament is making and achieving those recommendations. And hopefully within the next 5 years, the CPA recommends that the Parliament should, again, probably under a new Parliament, or if there are changes that have happened that are identifiable, they should conduct another self-assessment to see if there are any existing insensitivities or progress has been made from the last time they've conducted the self-assessment. So I would like to actually end my presentation with a quote from the former CWP chairperson, which says that the CWP recognises the important role it plays in raising and addressing issues related to gender equality, in particular, the representation of women in parliaments. The network will continue to encourage and support parliamentarians of all genders to include a gender perspective in all aspects of their role, legislation, oversight and representation, and to help parliaments become gender-sensitive institutions. The CPA, through the CWP, stands ready to support any CPA branch that's interested in adopting gender-sensitive practices to ensure they can successfully create and permanently maintain both a culture and environment that responds to the needs and interests of persons of all genders. So with that, I'd just like to conclude and just reiterate that the CPA, specifically myself in my role as a CWP network coordinator, is ready to help parliaments who are interested in conducting a self-assessment. And I would strongly encourage those parliaments who are interested to get in contact with be it their branch, the Clerk of Parliament, who will be the CPA branch secretary, or in fact, Honourable Valerie Woods in her capacity as the regional representative on the CWP steering committee to register its interest in conducting a self-assessment. So I've got a slide here with a barcode to the application, to the document, that we've developed on gender sensitizing Parliament. So that's both the field guide and the guidelines, should anyone be interested in having a look. And again, thank you very much. I'm here to answer any questions you may have. And I would like to, at this point, hand over to the next presenter.
So once the legislation has been approved, we have that responsibility as a gender machinery to run with that. We don't do it alone because we are a part of what we call a gender architecture. That allows us to work with other groups, other public sector groups, You heard earlier that we are a part of a larger group called MDAs, ministries, and those ministries have departments and agencies. We also work with the private sector. We work with community groups, faith-based groups, and all other groups that will be doing anything around gender-based violence, gender work. That's very broad. The second A looks at alignment. How do we ensure that the legislation that has gone through all of that process and all the work that has been done, that there is alignment? And what kind of alignment are we speaking about? We're talking about strategic alignment, making sure that if we have a plan or a policy or a project, that we link the goals and objectives and outcomes of that project with the goals, outcomes, and objectives of the legislation. So there is harmony, and it allows us to do that seamlessly. The third A looks at advocacy. I think I heard, she left? This is Natalie Nito Garvey. Wow. She used an expression that I like to use all the time, relentless advocacy. So I'll add some more R's to that, radical, resolute advocacy. I think when we have the legislation that has been approved, we have to now take that after all of the process that has taken place. We have that responsibility to look at how it is that on the ground we can be relentless, we can be radical, and we can be resolute in ensuring that the legislation is noised abroad, that everybody is aware of it, what is required. And if I could get practical, I heard mention that our minister just called the date of operation for the long-awaited Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act. It was approved in 2021. The date was last Monday, the 3rd. You may clap. And at this point, we are running with the implementation, not necessarily yet. We just want to make sure that persons are aware of what is required, what the legislation outlines, and to make sure that everybody is aware that there is a zero-tolerance approach to all forms of violence, particularly sexual harassment. So heads of agencies, persons in charge of entities have that responsibility to make sure that there is a sexual harassment workplace policy that's in line with the legislation. Don't worry, there's help. We don't expect you to do it alone. We have been having conversations in the media, and we have found that quite a few spaces have already started the process of making sure that they do have a sexual harassment workplace policy, or if they don't have a sexual harassment workplace policy, then they would have a statement that explains how it is that because this legislation is so important to groups, as you might have heard or not, it is gender neutral. So it speaks to sexual harassment done against men and sexual harassment done against women. So whoever it is that has this harassment done to him or her can complain and seek redress. The fourth A would look at action. And action for me is huge, so I have a few adjectives: targeted action, timely, and tactical action. I have 3 groups in this room that are a part of that action that I'm speaking about, and they are groups that are working on the ground. So Minister is not in the room, but were she here, she would talk about the COPE initiative. That's the Community Outreach through Partnership for Empowerment Initiative, which we have rolled out since 2019. We started, Richie, you know the story. We started with 8 partners, and last year we doubled the amount of money and the amount of partners, number of partners rather. This year we have, for the first time, 18 partners, and I have 3 groups here. Could I ask them to stand, please? Life Yard. So the gentleman who came up earlier, and he has somebody with him, Life Yard, thank you. They're working very hard in the communities, working with groups, especially young persons who are disenfranchised and perhaps would have been having issues with truancy. How do they do conflicts? How do they manage their time? You know, and they're helping them to have skills, sustainable skills. They're making stuff, and it's a lot. I cannot explain it all. Perhaps he would have to be the one to do that, but time would not allow me to get him up here again. Another group that we have is Terry still there? She just slipped out? Okay, so I'll do Jamaica Network of Rural Women Producers. Is she there? So that, you can stand. Perhaps some person's not seeing you because of the beam. So the Jamaica Network of Rural Women Producers, as the name suggests, is a group of rural women in parishes, I'll do Terry next, a group of women who are producing and harvesting and farming and doing a number of things in communities, but they do have a number of challenges. And so in order to have those challenges addressed, we added them to the COPE initiative. And they have been doing fantastic work. Just recently they got funds so they could get lots and plots of land, and they would have groups take those plots of land and use them to, shore up what they were doing earlier, which perhaps they didn't have enough land, they didn't have title for the land, they didn't have capital, seed capital, they didn't have persons who were there to staff, and perhaps some of what they wanted to do is to do niche marketing so they could be globally competitive. So we're not saying we're doing everything that we need to do, but we're trying based on what we have, the limited resources we have, and they are doing a lot of work out there based on the limited resources that we can share with them. The third group is Yard Empire. That's Terry Salmon. Could you stand so they can see you, Terry? Thank you. And Terry is with Yard Empire. Yard Empire is a group. It's an acronym is for just making sure that young people are very engaged, right, Terry? And you're using arts and recreational activities and drama and speech and all of that, the creative arts, to make sure that they are not getting into trouble, that they're using those creative energies in a meaningful way, and that they're contributing to development. So the question that was asked, how can we make the legislative process gender responsive? The answer is we make it gender responsive by ensuring that we engage in unrestricted and equitable access. We engage in strategic alignment. We take radical, resolute, and relentless advocacy so that we have targeted, timely, and tactical action, and that will allow us to pivot for purposeful positioning. I thank you.
I want to thank all these amazing women who have demonstrated their capacity and their preparedness to lead the rest of us. My only regret is that we do not have an entire day that we could have devoted to just that session alone, because we learned so much from all the presenters, starting with the minister. Now, as a chair, I am obliged to try now to bring us back as much on track as possible, because we have another session. So I will give a few minutes only, emphasis on few minutes, to those of you who might want to ask a question or seek some clarification. Yes, Senator Golding Campbell. No, hearing you better without the mic. The process of lawmaking.
Yeah, I'm going to try to present my points. So you described the process, and I wondered, in my own experience of seeing aspects of that process, is there any consideration as you look to tighten it, as you look to make it more efficient, of expanding the consultation process? I've felt for a long time that certainly on particularly bills that are of great interest to the public, that if we could start the consultation phase, we wouldn't necessarily have such a drawn-out process once we get to the Parliament, or maybe not even so much of a contentious process. I know we do a consultation after, well, certainly at the cabinet submission phase. I know there's one there, but it's usually pretty limited. I just wanted to hear the minister's thoughts on that.
And just to add to Senator, that we need also in your presentation that we simplify. because we are talking to the ordinary people, and these laws are made for all of us, and it don't make any sense one section understand and another section don't understand. So we really need to do that.
Thank you. Could you just pass the mic to the minister so she doesn't need to come to the podium? And Minister, 30 seconds. This is the one time I get to direct the minister what to do, so.
I believe we should look at every stage of the process, every stage of the 7-step. But when policy decisions are made by Cabinet is collectively responsible to the Parliament for the policy decisions. And I believe that if we get to the stage where the decisions are actually indicated in the Parliament before we move to making the laws, then you can have greater room for consideration of the issue. But generally, my default position is to allow for consultation and input, because I think if you're taking action that will impact people's lives, it's always helpful for them to have a say. No, it doesn't relieve you of your responsibility to make the decision. I think many times people confuse having an input with substituting the decision-making process. But I always believe there is much to be gained, generally speaking, to have people have their say. If you are going to be bound by legislation, you need to take ownership of it. And I think the more laws are internalized by the people, the greater the level of compliance will be.
Thank you, Minister. Any other questions? Senator Kamina Johnson-Smith.
Thank you, Senator. Is Ms. Jibateza still on?
Yes, yes. All the presenters are still on.
Lovely. Hi. Thank you very much. I wanted to ask Ms. Dibateza about just some of her numbers, because I came in, well, she went through them. They were very interesting to me. And I was noting, you had said 45 out of 180 parliaments have, only 45 have met the 30% target. And then you gave figures for the Commonwealth Caribbean. You gave us a figure of 11 and a figure of 4. And I wanted to just clarify what those, what those applied to. And I wanted to ask whether this 45 were Commonwealth countries, in fact. Were they 45 out of our 56? I was just trying to understand how the numbers fit together, as these are, I think, the most up-to-date figures that I would have heard, and I just thought everyone could benefit from knowing exactly where we are within the global scheme of things, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Again, for purposes of time, I did skip a bit of the beginning of my presentation, so apologies if I wasn't very clear. So in terms of the CPA, well, answer to your first question, it was 45 out of the 180 parliaments that form part of the CPA's membership. So the CPA, unlike other parliamentary organisations, in addition to national parliaments, sub-national parliaments also form part of our membership. So let's say, for example, in the case of Canada, every province individually is also a member of the CPA. But in the Caribbean region, that's loads of the overseas territories in their respective rights are branches and members of the CPA. So the data that I mentioned was 45 parliaments, which are parliaments across subnational and national members of the CPA. 45 out of the 180 have met the target. And specifically with the CAA region, of those 45, 4 of them are located in the CAA region. And when I mentioned before about the, was it 11 having no women members of parliament, that's again Commonwealth-wide, but in accordance to the CPA's breakdown. So subnational and national parliaments across 180 parliaments that form part of our membership.
Okay, thanks. You didn't have any of just the straight, federal / unicameral, not sub-parliaments, but the primary parliament
So the data is inclusive of the primary parliaments, but I'm happy to give you the national ones we have as well.
At a future date, I wouldn't take up everyone's time if everyone isn't interested.
I'm happy to send that via email to the conference coordinators if that's helpful.
Thank you, and thanks for a very helpful presentation as well. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So my final duty as chair is to thank the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the ministry and staff for organizing this event. I want to make one recommendation, that we do it again, not try to achieve so much in one day, and that we invite the male parliamentarians so that we can sensitize them to the significance of doing the gender self-assessment in Parliament and doing gender-responsive legislation. I think that once they understand it, because there are women who don't see the importance of a discourse like this, even though they are parliamentarians. So that's one of the things that I would like to say to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, even as I express my deepest gratitude. When the material is made available, please, women, do your own caucuses and invite other women to your table. And finally, let me say to all of you that I would like you to leave here with this quote: surround yourself with women who will mention your name in a room full of possibilities. That is how we can transform the world. Thank you. So I think at this stage I could trespass a little bit and invite Senator Shireen Golding to this podium as she now begins her leadership of session 3, which is legislation protecting women and other vulnerable groups, even as I ask those at the table to leave the stage. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, and we are working together these days, I see.
As Senator Golding gets ready for session 3, I must remind you about the feedback form. I believe they were emailed to you, and you all have them in your email. We're going to fill them out at the end of session 3. Okay? It is a requirement that you do the feedback form. Senator?
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies. All protocol observed. And good afternoon to any of the remaining gentlemen in the room. I too want to acknowledge MP Michael Phillips, who joined us this morning. I think he left a little earlier, but so significant, I think, that he was the sole male parliamentarian here that I'm joining my colleagues in welcoming him. My name, as far as my birth certificate is concerned, is Shireen Golding, and there's a marriage certificate somewhere that says Campbell is attached to that. I am the person assigned to chair this session this afternoon entitled Legislation Protecting Women and Other Vulnerable Groups. I happen to be an attorney at law in my day job. That is not to say that the Senate work is night job, but yeah, I was about to walk myself into a hole there, Minister. Thank you for that. But so I obviously have particular interest in this session. We have 3 most esteemed women who are going to do presentations for us today, and I am certainly looking forward to hearing what they have to share. the first, and I'm going to invite her to come and sit at the podium here, Senator, the Honorable Kamina Johnson-Smith, who is no stranger to most of us in this room, and certainly not to the online community. She is our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. We are also going to be joined, I believe, online by the Honorable Dolores Balderramos Garcia, who is the Minister of Human Development, Families, and Indigenous Peoples Affairs from Belize. Is she, do we have her online? We do? Okay, great. And also the Honorable Dr. Virginia Albert Poyot, Minister for the Public Service, Home Affairs, Labor and Gender Affairs from St. Lucia. So we have a great group. Let me just say a little bit before I want to launch right into the presentations. I know we are running against time. The calendar had us doing an hour and a half, I believe it was, and we've lost half an hour. So I'm going to do my best to catch up a bit. Senator the Honorable Kamina Johnson-Smith has been an attorney at law for close to 22 years. She has worked both in private practice and as corporate in-house counsel. It's strange for me to be introducing her because I feel like I know her so well, so I'm going to come off script a little bit. She was the first female Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade in our country. And I think that is huge, not the least because she certainly plays that role extremely well. And every time she walks and every time she opens her mouth, competence and diligence is written all over everything she says. So that is her current role. She was first appointed in 2016, reappointed in 2020. She also serves as our leader of government business in the Senate. And she has been a champion on many of the gender issues affecting women. She has been a strong advocate in the attainment of Jamaica's sustainable development goals, strengthening Jamaica's contribution to important global efforts to build peace and security, fostering a respect for human rights, and promoting a strong and fair multilateral trading system. Senator Johnson-Smith, I'll just credential her a little bit, holds a Master's of Laws in Commercial Law from the LSE, London School of Economics, and a Bachelor of Laws and Arts in French from the University of West Indies, that's Cave Hill and Mona. And she's, of course, also a graduate of Norman Manley Law School. So I'm going to invite her now to come and share with us in this session, legislation protecting women, children, and vulnerable groups. Please welcome.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Shireen. I very much appreciate it, and I'm going to use the opportunity to do a small free ad. I am the newly appointed and sworn in Justice of the Peace, who provides, and just happens to be, that since my swearing in, I have only provided after-hours service to women who are mothers and who work. So my dining room has become the JP Center for women who do not find the time to visit a JP during working hours. So I'm here to tell you that I am available, and I am quite happy, and my husband is very understanding, and I send him inside when he's not properly dressed. So, but that's a new area of service, and one that I'm quite enjoying because it's so simple, but it's something that so many people need. And so I remember my own frustrations. I'm very happy to add that to my credentialing that Shireen so happily provided for me. So my apologies for being late, and my apologies also for not having a structured presentation. The area is so wide, it is so vast, and you know how Minister Grange is, right? So she says, no, just come and share, you know. So I have come with a heart full of and ready to share, and but I'm trying to condense some of the material in a way that hopefully will be interesting and that will maybe provoke more questions that will help discussion, because the material is quite robust. So one of the ways in which I like to contextualize the work of legislation to protect women, children, elderly, other vulnerable groups is to think about the fact that when we, or rather how I contextualize its importance, is that I always note, especially on the international scene, that when we look at Jamaica's statistics, front of page statistics, we are always so empowered in the sense of women, the roles that women hold in government, in public sector, in service. And it sometimes covers the need for what I have always viewed as this very important substratum of the power dynamic, which is abuse and violence. So we look, I'm sure you've probably all been through the figures already. We have 29% women in the lower house. We have 38% women in the upper house. When you put them together, we have 31% in Parliament generally. Of our 84 Parliament, right? So we have 84% in Cabinet. We have 5 of the 19, so that's 26%, just under the 30. And permanent secretaries, we have 11 out of 16, which is 69%. You know, I'm a numbers girl in a former life, although I'm more qualitative nowadays. And then when we look across the piece, of course, we have former Attorney General, but we have, Attorney General is no longer female, but we have the DPP, the Auditor General, Administrator General, Registrar of Titles, significant senior positions. These are held by women, Commissioner of Customs. And, you know, when we look at that picture and we note, I recall when I was in opposition and started, I had the spokesperson role in the Senate on gender, and I had started looking at some of the figures. And the parish courts were 80% women, the Supreme Court was 50% women, and the appeal court was just under 1/3 women. And when I looked at the figures again, just preparing for today, I don't have the parish court, although I'm quite sure it's somewhere still around 80. But the Supreme Court is now at 71%, and the Court of Appeal is now 9 out of 13 at 69. So where there are no constitutional barriers, no legal barriers to movement, where meritocracy is applied to appointments and cultural issues are not at play, the movement of women in society in Jamaica, in power positions in Jamaica, has been quite phenomenal. And when you consider that this is from 1944, when the first woman was elected, the first year of adult suffrage, and you look at where we are today, it's a significant move, although we still have great deficiencies in the private sector. Private sector boards are still just at that, below that 30% window. We know that while pay in the public service is equal, it is not, or rather you're free from discrimination and, on the basis of your sex in respect of that type of pay in the private sector, because of the difficulties with sharing of information, privacy of information. And in a free market economy, it's much more difficult to enforce or to actually be aware of where those things are not being enforced. So again, front of page, Jamaica is a land of empowered women, and a land of powerful women, and a land of women with power. However, when we start to look at the levels of sexual harassment, when we look at the levels of sexual abuse, and you even look at the reports into CPFSA, you know that physical abuse is disproportionately, boys are represented disproportionately in physical abuse, and girls are disproportionately represented in sexual abuse. That when you look at violence against physical violence, in the murder rate, males are higher represented, and then women in the sexual crimes, again, higher represented. And it's not just a function of reporting. Even if you discount, I know whenever I don't have the specific statistics with me, but when you raise the stats, people say, oh, but men probably underreport. Even if you discount underreporting by 25%, women still are disproportionately represented in offenses of domestic violence, in sexual abuse. So the issue of violence and how it affects women, how it affects children, how it affects our elderly. We know, we've seen in the reports, the numbers are not high, but heinous crimes carried out against our vulnerable populations is an important thing, and it is a responsibility of the state to legislate against it where possible, to strengthen legislation to prevent and to protect. And where it is that we can, I feel strongly about this personally, is that we also need to strengthen the penalties, particularly in respect of this matter. So, these matters. In 2013, I moved a motion in the Senate, and it was finally approved in 2015, and it was to review 4 major pieces of legislation: the Sexual Offences Act, Child Care and Protection Act, Domestic Violence Act, and the Offences Against the Persons Act, all with a view to strengthening the penalties for violence against women and children. When I moved the motion, it was amended to include persons with disabilities, and that was accepted and, of course, unanimously supported. The debate, the Joint Select Committee actually crossed administrations, and the report itself was not actually finalized until 2018. We still are awaiting the actual amendments to come to Parliament on the 4 pieces of legislation. So the Domestic Violence Act is being completely reviewed, although the full, it's being reviewed, but the extent to which it is felt it is needed will not be undertaken in the first phase. But, for example, the Domestic Violence Act never had a definition of domestic violence. It didn't include an emotional component, a financial component. It didn't include psychological abuse, financial abuse, or any of the other ways in which control is exercised in a domestic relationship. It never included the visiting relationship, where we know that informal relationships exist within which protection is required, so that how the act was structured or is structured in respect of protection orders. Protection orders could only be given if you lived with the person. And if you did not live with the person, but this is somebody who is your baby father or your baby mother, wherever, in whichever direction the violence is being perpetrated, and if children were being affected, there was nothing to protect. It also did not provide for anyone else to apply for the protection orders. And these are matters which are now being fundamentally addressed. I understand it is very far progressed. It is at the last stage. So we are hopeful that within this legislative year, the new Domestic Violence Amendment Act will come forward. It is a passion area for Minister Grange, and it is something that she is pressing on. It has had a few, I think, technical issues, but is moving along well. And it is one of these things that will be welcomed. It is going to expand significantly the protection which is granted now, recognizing some of the realities which exist in our society and looking beyond that. Let me not go any further with that, because I know, Chair, that you're going to be trying to tighten. The Sexual Harassment Act was just mentioned, And I will just say a little bit more about that because it's so important with the July 3rd date having coming into effect. And I want to congratulate the Bureau of Gender Affairs for all the work that they have done in spreading the word about it, in working through this year of transition since it was passed, to try to share some of the information about it. And the debate during the Sexual Harassment Act, I think, and including the Joint Select Committee, I think highlighted a lot of the ways in which cultural issues and cultural predispositions impact upon legislation that has a gender focus. I won't go through some of the ridiculous comments that were made, and sorry if I'm impolitic, but they were, and I won't call out anybody specifically for them, but you know, Hansard lives to tell the tale, and women listened and heard. Women heard and saw themselves represented and in issues which they knew they had to fight through. We know that sexual harassment affects women of all socioeconomic demographics. It is not a function of power, class, race, or community. It is something that cuts across. Sorry, I mentioned power, but it is about power. And even where power is not unequally distributed, meaning as between co-workers, as between students, as between teachers. So without having a power of employment, that sexual harassment can occur and it can disempower. These were things which we had to work through because there were people who felt that sexual harassment should only be an issue if there is a power dynamic between employer and worker. So only if you have a power to say whether I can or not be hired or whether I can or not be promoted, only then should sexual harassment be an issue. As opposed to recognizing that if you are a worker in an environment where a co-worker makes your ability to work absolutely unsupportable because of unwanted sexual advances, then this is a matter, despite that employment power dynamic missing, it is something that affects your ability to work, and it is a problem that you should be able to complain about to your employer, and there should be redress. So it is widening the sense of what needs to be done. It looks at educational institutions, recognizing, again, between teacher and student, between teachers, between students, it exists. Within care institutions, it is between caregiver and care receiver, and among children and caregivers, that the power dynamic is not the sole determinant. It is the fact of a sexual advance being unwanted that is the issue. So the Act addresses, it's gender neutral, just to share for those who are not aware, it is gender neutral, so redress can be claimed by both men and women. It is agnostic to the workplace, so it doesn't define that you have to be in an office in order for it to occur. If you're on a business trip, if you are at a conference, if you are harassed, the issue is the unwanted nature of the sexual advance, not the place where it takes place. And that is therefore a matter which was taken into consideration. It addresses private and public sector institutions as well. It deals with landlord and tenant as well. How many young people, young women, you know, perhaps with a child leaving a stressful environment or a stressful relationship and striking it out, is now at the will of a predatory landlord who tries to say, you know, that they'll only allow her the room or her the room at a particular rate if it is that there are benefits undocumented to apply to him. These are things which are lived experiences from the wholesale to the corporate boardroom. Dynamics occur to harass. And again, I speak largely about women because although it does occur to men, statistically, it more disproportionately affects women. And that is our reality. I don't think we should shy away from it. The Act allows for both, but clearly the concern is greater in respect of how it impacts women, and therefore it is a matter which is being addressed. I look forward to even greater public sensitization about it and how it is that we ensure that the simplified information is made clear and that people understand that nobody is outlawing flirting, nobody is allowing the ability to start new relationships in new environments, but when an advance is unwanted, it is unwanted and it must be respected. So it's about respecting each other. Yeah. And I do recall in the debate that someone had asked for an amendment that a complaint could only be actionable if a woman expressly said no in respect to an advance. I said, my God. I said, for how many years have we been learning how to laugh politely, how to step quietly out of a group photo so that you don't disrupt everybody, how it is that you change a subject in a way that maybe doesn't make a meeting sound contentious? How many years of silent suffering have women had to deal with that we must put in the law that they must say no? The act is needed because we haven't felt like we're able to say no without being punished for it. So that amendment was not accepted. To put it mildly, the amendment was not accepted, and the act allows for the recognition of how it is that sexual harassment occurs. And it is hoped that greater discussion will take place on these matters to allow men and women to understand about boundaries, how they're set, respect, changing cultures, and about it not being an issue of demasculation or emasculation, but just about respecting each other, what we want and what we don't want from each other, which is perfectly respectable. Child care protection, sexual offenses, Offenses Against the Persons Act, there's lots of work being done there as well. They are coming. Issues being dealt with, like eliminating the conditions for marital rape. So the act as it now is, the act as it was passed in 2009 provided for conditions to be met in order for a wife to claim rape. There had to be separation, there had to be, I think it was about 3 criteria, options, or knowingly HIV. So there are specific things that would allow you to be able to claim that you were raped in marriage. And it was agreed that rape is rape. It's about power. It's not about sex. And it should not be that a married woman has less rights than an unmarried woman. So that an unmarried woman, if she's raped, has no preconditions save the lack of consent. But if a married woman is raped, apart from the fact that she hasn't consent, she must prove that you're legally separated and that although there is no signed agreement, you have to prove 1,000 things why it is that you had the capacity to consent. Why should a married woman have less rights than an unmarried woman? Both of us should have the right over our bodies. And that was what was agreed by the committee. So when the act is amended, it will delete all of the preconditions for claim of marital rape. Again, it's about respect and the right over our bodies. We will be ensuring there is an offense of stalking so that women are protected outside, again, of relationships. If you are harassed by a stalker, that offense does not exist. And it needs to exist within the Offenses Against the Persons Act so that the Cybercrimes Act can criminalize it so that, again, whether you are in a relationship or not, if you are being stalked and you are in fear that that is an actionable crime, that it can be prosecuted and that you can be protected. You can get a protective order and you can prevent the greater crimes that usually come as a result of stalking, which is, as we know, rape or murder. So we're creating an offense of stalking now, and that is again something that was recommended by the committee. There is so much more, and I feel the chairman looking into my ears. So I know that I have way gone over my time, but as I said, there's a lot to share about the discourse. about some of the cultural issues that we unpack as we try to pass legislation to give greater protection to women, children, and persons, elderly and persons with disabilities. I think one other aspect that I will share is that the Joint Select Committee agreed that across the piece, women who are known to be or visibly pregnant, persons who are above the age of 70, children who are aged 12 and under, as well as women, are to be considered a vulnerable category for the purposes of sentencing where sexual offenses or grievous sexual assault is perpetrated, and that in all of those circumstances they should provide for a mandatory minimum of 20 years for the offense. So that is one of the things we see, some of these egregious things. And a proposal made by me, and one which I continue in my quiet little corner to advocate for, but it will require adjustment of the sentencing guidelines, is that it is now time for us to look beyond concurrent sentences once offenses come out of the same set of facts, where the offenses concerned are in relation to sexual crimes against children or other vulnerable persons, because it cannot be that someone can rape, abduct, murder, and also perpetrate a fraud against the family by pretending to be a person searching for this abducted child, and that person can get 12 years because every offense carries sentences that run concurrently. To me, that is not justice, and victims require justice too. So that is something that I leave with you to think about, because I think it is something that we have crossed that threshold about how it is we as a society say to these barbaric criminals who would do these things against vulnerable or most vulnerable children in particular, and say that it is unacceptable. And it's not only unacceptable, it's unacceptable to the point that we don't even want to leave it to the discretion of the judges. The judges must take a fundamentally different stance to strengthen how it is they punish and separate those people from society. Thank you.
Just for the record, Minister Johnson-Smith, I wasn't looking to wrap you up, you know. I was so engaged with what you were saying and processing that I was totally wrapped up. Thank you very much for that. I know everybody here found that so useful, as did I. I want to just move really quickly introducing our next presenter. Thank you. The Honorable Dolores Balderramos Garcia, Minister of Human Development, Families, and Indigenous Peoples Affairs from Belize. She has newly been appointed in that role and has served previously in that ministry. She is cognizant of issues impacting the people of Belize. She's a trained teacher and attorney at law, and she has focused on supporting issues through education, strengthening the existing legal framework, and she has worked in close collaboration with organizations dealing with HIV and AIDS in Belize, and she has done extensive work of advocacy in that area. I'm so sorry. She was educated in the United States, in Wisconsin, and has a master's degree in English. And of course, she is a graduate of the University of West Indies, where she studied law. I'd like to ask you to welcome her to say a few words to us this afternoon. Time is against us, but I am not going to limit my presenters. I'll take the hit at the end. Thank you. Please welcome the Honorable Dolores Balderramos Garcia.
Pleasant good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It is a pleasure and honor to be here at this regional conference on women's political and parliamentary leadership, led by the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarian Association. Thank you. Thank you for asking me to join. I'd like to acknowledge a good colleague who joined us in Belize just 2 weeks ago. The person who just presented before me, Foreign Minister Honorable Kamina Johnson-Smith. It's a pleasure to see you again. And I was very interested in what you had to say. But I want to acknowledge all our Jamaican friends who are physically present at the conference, and also everyone, sorry, throughout the Caribbean joining us this afternoon. Again, I want to say it's a pleasure, and it's good to be here presenting on this topic of protecting women and other vulnerable groups. I think I could maybe start by saying that it's kind of great when you stick around for a while, because I was first in a National Assembly, and in the National Assembly of Belize back in 1993. As a matter of fact, I was pregnant with our second child at the time, and I've really been in politics a long time, as you can probably tell. It's good to stick around a good while, because you get to really do some of the things you would like to do in terms of changing the laws. And that, I believe, I have always believed, is one of the best ways of fomenting and actually achieving real positive change in any country through legislation. We have to put our money where our mouth is, and we have to stand and live with the courage of our convictions. And so I'm really, really happy once again to be here. I'm not very happy to say to participants this afternoon that I am the only woman in cabinet. My colleague Magali Marin-Young left cabinet just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm like the cheese standing alone, as our cabinet secretary said to us, but never mind. And I promised that I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't speak twice as loud, but I may have to speak twice as much, because we still have the same agenda and we still have to get things done. So it's good that we can be here this afternoon. Now in Belize, we have only, and this is very sad to say, we have only 12.9% elected members in our House of Representatives. In the Senate, it's a little bit better. The Senate is an appointed body. We have 38.5% women for an average of about 20% or 20.5%. Very low, and it is something that we absolutely have to work on. By having so few women in our 31-member House, there are only 4 of us, the government has tried to compensate by appointing more women in the Senate, and also in very important high-level bodies. For example, we have a number of women chief executive officers. We have many women who are heads of organizations and statutory bodies. And we are coming along. The difficulty is that few women really wish to get into the electoral fray. I heard one of our colleagues this morning saying it's a blood sport. And it is not easy. And it doesn't get any easier. But we have to put our shoulders to the wheel. Now, recently, we have formed our Belizean Women Parliamentarian Caucus. It's only about 10 of us. And it's almost like Third World. The song by Third World from Jamaica said, now that we've found love, what are we going to do with it? So it's, what are we going to do with this Women's Political Caucus? Women's Parliamentarian Caucus, rather, I should say, in Belize. We're figuring it out. And I am very, very happy at the rich discussion this afternoon. And of course, the comments and the guidance of Eilish Elliott, who really put us a long way in terms of the various approaches we can take. But I am thrilled that we were able to get this done. And it shows the political will when we have partners and when we have people who are willing to work with us. So we take the good advice of Eilish and others, And I'd like to mention, along the lines of what our good colleague, Minister Johnson Smith has said, we are very committed to the laws that protect women, children, and other vulnerable groups. We've done a number of good things. We've updated our domestic violence legislation, and back in, or maybe 20 odd years or so ago, and I'm happy to have been associated with it, we recognized the unpaid work of women, especially in the home. And it is something that we're still talking about in the Caribbean and throughout the Commonwealth. I think there was an important decision out of Mumbai, India the other day, recognizing the value of women being in the home, being, as we would say in Spanish, amas de casa, the lovers of the home and the caregivers and caretakers in the home. We recognized that very important role. And we did pass laws back in 2001 to say that on a divorce, the unpaid work of women in the home it is that, and the input that women bring is absolutely important. Now, in terms of our domestic violence legislation and also the recognition of women's work in the home, we've built a lot on that, but there is a lot more to do. There is just so much more to do. Now, I'd like to say that nowadays, there is what we call a human rights agenda. And that human rights agenda is extremely important in our point of view, because of the amount of work that is left to be done to protect our vulnerable groups, including women and children, persons with disability, persons in a minority community, for example. And so the work being there, we have to make sure that we try to get it done. Now, I want to acknowledge that the past speaker of our House of Representatives, Laura Tucker Longsworth, was very, very much committed. And also our present speaker, very, very much committed, Valerie Woods, to the advancement of women's rights and the rights of vulnerable groups, including the LGBT+ community. I think that is something we must put squarely on the agenda in our countries. It is not a foreign agenda. It talks about the vulnerabilities of our own people. And as I have said, and I will probably repeat once or twice before I step off the stage, we must have the courage of our convictions to make these things happen. Belize is now in the process, and we may be playing catch up to Jamaica and some other territories here, but we are in the process now of enacting our disabilities legislation. We also are looking at the CARICOM model for the anti-sexual harassment legislation, and we're thrilled to hear that Jamaica, I think on the 3rd of July, introduced that act as an act of the Jamaican National Assembly, and it is now law. So we look to our sisters and brothers in Jamaica, and we will definitely follow suit where it is best to do so. Now, recently, we have also been in the process of promulgating a new national gender policy. And again, there may be two sticking point areas, colleagues, and that is the area of having young people and teenagers have access to sexual and reproductive care without parental consent. Some of the fundamentalist churches don't want to hear that. And also the other area of a sticking point that some people may not want to hear, but we absolutely must do our lobbying and our promotion, standing by the courage of our convictions, and that is the area of addressing vulnerable groups such as the LGBT+ community. There are people, like I say, and I believe it is in the minority in Belize, because we do have an aware and progressive population by and large, but you will get some pushback. We will get some pushback when we talk about issues of gender identity. and our vulnerable populations, including our LGBT plus community. So we're looking at that carefully, and we're going to be bringing forward hate crime legislation to make it an aggravating factor when an attack is made on someone and that person is a member of a vulnerable group. We also, and this might be the highest hanging fruit, we're looking at the lower hanging fruit first, but the higher hanging fruit, we will be looking at what we call equal opportunity legislation. And again, it's going to be a hill to climb, but we must do so when we feel that it is the right thing to do and that it is a homegrown agenda and not a foreign agenda. I'd also like to mention two things I could say that are very important in mentioning here today in the legislation to promote and to help to protect vulnerable groups and women and children. And that is the repeal of the HIV legislation that we passed some 20 or so years ago. And I'm not happy to say that I was associated with that bit of legislation, making it a criminal offense for the knowing or reckless transmission of HIV. At that time, HIV was frightening. It appeared for some to be a death sentence. We did not have the provision of the antiretroviral medications that we have today. And so at that time, we felt in terms of our advocacy that it was the correct thing to do. Now, looking at the human rights approach in everything that we must do now, we realized the error of our ways at that time. And also, one of the unintended consequences of passing that legislation was that we were putting women who were living with HIV in danger of the mother-to-child transmission being possibly penalized. Now, we never had a case of it. And so recently, I'm happy to say that within the last couple of weeks, we have repealed the legislation because in terms of the World Health Organization, the WHO, it was difficult, well, it would have been impossible for Belize to have achieved the validation of the elimination of mother-to-child transmission of HIV if we had not repealed that onerous piece of legislation. And I'm happy to say, colleagues, that we're proud today to have done that. We're very proud today to have done that. A friend of mine recently said, and I'm not ringing my own bell here, but I think it is so important to talk about partnership and about advocacy. And the person said to me, Dolores, when you are there, you move the needle. But I want to say that it's not just me. We have wonderful partners. We have wonderful advocates. We have people who believe in protecting our vulnerable groups, and those are the people whom we work with. I would also like to share briefly with you that in passing a motion before the National Assembly last year, condemning all forms of gender-based violence. After that, we looked at a posthumous pardon for a lady named Nora Parham, who was actually hanged at the gallows in Belize in 1963 because of a domestic violence incident in which her then partner, a Belize police officer, met his untimely death. Nora Parham was the victim of a horrendous form of domestic and gender-based violence. Her children, all 8 of her sons now who are still alive, some of the older ones can recount having to run to the police station at night to call the police to come because the man who was Nora Parham's partner at the time used to kick her down the stairs and used to pull her by the hair and inflict horrendous beatings, even when she was pregnant. And so we decided that it was time. And we felt that it was never too late to correct a wrong that had been done back in 1963. It's emotional, but all 8 of Nora Parham's sons were present at the ceremony in which our Governor General in exercise of the prerogative of mercy under the Belize Constitution, granted a posthumous pardon to Nora Parham, and we were able to honor her by constructing a proper grave because she had been put in the ground without even a marker of where she was laid to rest. So I am happy, colleagues, to share that with you today. It was an act that was, you could say, symbolic. It wasn't a real person living who was being pardoned, but it was something that we felt we needed to do to signal in the strongest terms our condemnation of all forms of gender-based violence, and we will be working hand in hand with the Spotlight Initiative sponsored by the EU and the United Nations. We have come a long way in terms of those partnerships. And I'm really very happy to share with you that our human rights agenda, as I call it, is very much in stream. And I would hope that in the next year or two, we could have passed these important pieces of legislation. I want to repeat that in moving towards legislation that protects women and other vulnerable groups, we must lobby, we must be indefatigable, never give up. We must work with all our partners. We must collaborate. But I end this presentation in which I have been so happy to participate. I end this intervention at this important conference by saying that we must continue to have the courage of our convictions to do the right thing, to defend our women, our children, our vulnerable people, our people with disabilities, our LGBT plus community, and everyone who needs the help. As a matter of fact, the motto of our Ministry of Human Development, Families and Indigenous Peoples Affairs is equality and inclusion, and that is how I would end off this afternoon. Thank you for your kind attention.
I want to thank the Honorable Dolores. I'm so sorry, I have to put my eyes on. I want to thank the Honorable Dolores Balderramos Garcia for her very insightful comments and her sharing the experience in Belize, both how they have dealt with the number disparity in the parliament and some of the things that they're doing to right the wrongs, to sort of equalize on the balance scale and to ensure the protection of women and other vulnerable groups. I'm going to ask now that you help me to welcome the Honorable Dr. Virginia Albert Poyot from St. Lucia, who took office in 2021 as the Minister for Public Service, Home Affairs, Labor and Gender Affairs. She has been a career educator. She's an advocate for social justice, human and trade union rights, quality education, gender equality and equity. She's also very active championing basic community facilities and an advocate for better pay and improved working conditions for teachers. She now serves as minister and is joining us this afternoon online and is going to share with us from her perspective on the protection of women and other vulnerable groups through legislation. Please welcome her.
Good afternoon, all distinguished delegates at this conference. It's unfortunate that I am unable to be with you in person. However, I have been following from morning, and I was almost of the fear that I may not get a chance to share some of my thoughts with you. However, last but not least, but I will try and share some of my thoughts with you. I am Minister for the Public Service, Home Affairs, Labor and Gender Affairs in St. Lucia. So sometimes I say I have the whole government under my watch. I came from Parliament last night, late after 9 p.m., debating some very important legislation where we did amendment to the value-added tax. And what was most striking in the legislation that we amended is where government passed legislation to make it zero-rated tax on sanitary towels, pads, napkins, tampons, and similar articles. And that is a major victory, in my view, for women. And I think we got quite a few calls and WhatsApp and feedback from women in general who are very pleased that government has actually included that item in the list of some of the items that would be zero rated, and they will remove VAT on these items. And imagine that is coming among items like lumber, cement, galvanized steel, and plywood. This is demonstrating how important government takes issues that affect women. In our parliament in St. Lucia, we have just about 11.76% in the lower house that are women, and 54.54% in the upper house are women. That gives us an overall average of 28.57% in the parliament. The Prime Minister, who I have described as a Prime Minister who is gender sensitive because he makes work a lot easier for me when it comes to policies and certain legislation, that he had the prerogative of appointing senators, and 83% of the senators he appointed are women. So I am blessed with that kind of presence and support. But when we look at the issue of legislation protecting women and other vulnerable groups and girls, St. Lucia last year, 2022, passed the Domestic Violence Act. And that has created a wave in the country nationally. It has also caught the attention of persons in the regional and international forum. And what we consider to be some of the very progressive clauses that we added in that legislation. And it is a legislation that was well sold out to the public. They were well sensitized. And sometimes we talk about legislation, and sometimes some legislations have very good intentions. But when it comes to implementation and application, they get lost in the public domain. But the Gender Violence Act did get quite a bit of publicity at the national level, where it dominated the media as headline news item for about 3 weeks. With regards to looking at legislation, it's not always the law. Sometimes you have certain policies and cabinet decision. And the government, the cabinet has agreed to establish gender focal points in all government ministries in St. Lucia to ensure that we have gender mainstreaming in all government's programs. So that gives us the legitimacy to demand the material, human, and financial resources that we need to advance the cause of women and girls. The Gender Department has actually engaged in training officers, high-ranking officers in gender, and we are in the process of doing a similar exercise for parliamentarians. And in the budget this year, the Gender Department was in all its glory, because whatever allocation Yes, can you hear me? Hello? I'm saying, can you hear me?
We are hearing you. Are you hearing us?
Oh, all right, because
Okay,
I think
good.
there was a break in the internet.
Yes, I think we lost you for about 30 seconds.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm making the point that the gender department did get 100% of their requests, whatever they requested for the gender department in the budget for 23-24. And that gave a 25% increase in budgetary allocation to the gender department. So that is a very positive sign. And then as minister with responsibility for labor, the Prime Minister, we have commissioned a committee to review minimum and livable wages in St. Lucia. And we know that women will benefit tremendously from that exercise because we find that women find themselves in the lower bracket with regards to income. So that minimum and livable wages that the report is in, and the Prime Minister will be looking at it. I know it will have serious implications for the private sector, even government itself. But we feel that women should get a decent wage because most of them are single mothers and they are really struggling to make ends meet. And when we look at the issue of domestic workers and unpaid care work, this is an area that we have to address to ensure that women do get some kind of satisfaction for the work that they do. With regards to Convention 190 of the ILO that looks at violence and harassment convention, it is one that we are in the process of ensuring that the government ratify so that we can protect our women, especially those who are being harassed. As I heard one of the presenters earlier mention, that we look at gender neutral. So sometimes harassment do come on both sides. So we try to keep the language in a manner that it will satisfy both gender in our effort to achieve gender equality. And then we look at the ILO Convention 189 that speaks to domestic violence. We need, especially in the workplace, we have to ensure that we maintain dignity and respect persons in the workplace. We also look at the issue of elimination of discrimination of persons with disabilities. This is one legislation that St. Lucia has passed. And our Labor Act speaks to discrimination in the workplace. It speaks to sexual harassment, as well as our criminal code. Our criminal code, which was passed in 2004, treats sexual harassment as unlawful, and anybody who becomes a victim of sexual harassment is due to be compensated. So I want to ensure, to reiterate, that when it comes to legislation and protecting women and girls and other vulnerable groups, we have to go within our existing legislation and ensure that we enforce this legislation, put them into action, and that is what is critical. Sometimes we are keen to have the law. Yes, the law is the first step, but implementation of these legislation is where the biggest challenge is. And therefore, we need all on board in terms of not just government and politicians, but we need civil society. We need persons to buy in. And therefore, we need to do a lot of advocacy for us to ensure that we get these implemented to benefit the persons who are supposed to benefit from it. Today has been a long day for me. Today, I normally refer to it as Holy Constituency Day. As a politician, we have a day when we have to interact with our constituent. However, I chose to sit at this session all alone from morning. I've been following the whole session, and I was pleased to learn from my colleagues some of the brilliant ideas that came out from the session. And I do hope that we can adapt and adopt some of the suggestions coming out of this conference. I want to thank my Jamaican colleagues and the Commonwealth Women of Parliament for inviting me to participate in this session. We had a similar session in St. Lucia, which went very well, and I thought I needed to participate in this one to lend my support to my Caribbean colleagues. I thank you.
And we thank you very much as well, Dr. Poyet. We appreciated the thoughts that you shared with us. Boy, it's been a wallop, hasn't it? It has been quite a wallop of information, and I'm still processing some of what Senator Kamina Johnson-Smith had said, and hearing what the Honorable Dolores Valderramos Garcia said about that story with that woman who they gave a pardon to. So, and I thank you, Dr. Poyet, for your contributions, particularly raising to our attention the issue of budgeting, because it is all well and good that we pass laws and we seek to enforce laws when they are passed, but there's a phase, and I know my Bureau of Gender Affairs can connect to this, of implementation, which requires money, requires that our budgeting matches our policy and legislation imperatives. So with that said, I am going to, what I have on this, we're going to have a discussions in our working coffee break. Is that still on the table, or do I have the power to move past that? I'm going to move past the coffee break. We're almost at dinner time anyway. I know if there's anything here, I'm not even seeing anything here. So let's move past that. I'm going to invite questions to our presenters. Yes, okay, so if you do wish to have coffee or whatever comes with coffee, then please feel free to just get up and help yourself while we invite questions to our presenters. And the first one, Senator Janice Allen. Can we get a mic to her, please? Is that the only mic? Okay. Oh, here we go. No, leave that for Senator Johnson.
Thank you very much, Senator, my colleague, Senator Sister. I first wanted to, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Minister. I wanted to first just comment on I was quite moved by the story in Belize and the posthumous pardoning of that woman. It says a lot about a government when they are prepared to right the wrongs and not be too big to admit that something was wrong and do something about it. And I commend the government for that. I also commend said government and Minister Valderramos Garcia for herself also acknowledging that when the legislation was developed for HIV/AIDS, her own limitation and the time that it was developed, and her recognizing an adjustment needed to be made and taking steps to doing that. Sometimes politicians are not seen as human beings, and you work with what you have and make the best decision for the time. And it's okay when you get more information, you use it and do differently. I wanted to ask Dr. Valderramos, Minister Valderramos Garcia, at a point in time she was clarifying the calculation of the woman, the stay-at-home wife or partner. There was we lost a part of the presentation where she was speaking about the calculation of the value, I guess, or she was speaking to how the separation and the amount in the divorce settlement, because she's doesn't work, and how that went through in that legislation. I was quite keen to hear a little bit more about that.
Minister, you want to just, do we still have Minister online? Yeah. Do you want to just maybe just summarize the point, and then answer the question?
Surely. Thank you for the question. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, indeed. In 2001, we passed an amendment to what we then called the Supreme Court of Judicature Act. We now have the High Court, but at that time it was Supreme Court in our nomenclature. Basically, what we did was we enacted that various aspects must be brought into account on a divorce, because prior to that legislation, a woman really could have found herself on the street because working in the home was not given an economic value. For example, in Belize, you could have a little panades shop or you could make Johnny cake, but many times that was brought into account as contribution because the woman did not work actually outside of the home. And so if the matrimonial property, more than likely the home, was in the man's name, really the woman could have found herself, again, without a roof over her head. So I don't have the law in front of me right at this moment, but I can say that there were various aspects of women's contribution to a marriage and to a home that the law was amended to mandate that the court must take into account these contributions: number of children, whether the woman is educated, the age of all the parties, so that on a divorce, someone doesn't find himself or herself. And it is gender neutral, but mostly it affects women. So the woman wouldn't find herself unable to maintain, herself or what remaining family there is, because the home goes to the man. So we made that amendment, which was very important. I know that in some first world countries, you talk about the 50-50, and that is why, people like Melinda Gates and them, they could have gotten billions on a divorce. But so we don't have that, but we do have the important legislation, which I would be willing to share, that there are various aspects that must be brought into account, but mainly the unpaid work, which is valuable, of the woman within the home in raising children, being the ama de casa, taking care of the family and making sure that that everything is on the up and up. Now, and this applies to common law spouses as well. Again, gender neutral, but it applies to common law spouses. And in our definition of common law spouse, it would be two persons living together for a minimum of 5 years, but neither of them being actually married to someone else. So in terms of the legal advice that I used to give when, as a private attorney, I would always say to people, make sure if you're a younger woman and you've started a relationship with a man, make sure he isn't still married to somebody else, because you could be there living for 6, 7, 10 years. And then when something happens to him, you find yourself in a pickle, if we could put it that way. So I just wanted to share that by way of a little bit of answer and clarification. And I would be more than happy to share the way that Belize has done it. But clearly, our sister Caribbean countries, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, I'm pretty sure that they have aspects of the same kind of legislation, so that there can be good gender neutral again, but good equality for people in situations.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions, anyone? I wonder if I could just put this to all three of our presenters in this session. Oh, I wasn't seeing it. Okay, I'll ask my question after. Thank you, go ahead.
Afternoon. It's not a question, but an observation. And I cannot overemphasize the value that I have gotten from this kind of presentation and information that women here have gathered to express the matters that affect women so integrally. I am also concerned that we assume that men know, and I am saddened a bit that MP had to leave, the lone gentleman, well, no, another gentleman is here, the lone male MP that is here. It is very, very important, and I am going to encourage the powers that be, that if we could, even from the gender ministry, that if we could get this out into communities as well. Because I usually hear the saying women's rights, and I am for one who would say equal rights, but just having access to information that has been said here today, I am really, really encouraged, and I am going to encourage so that we get it out into our society, and it certainly will change the outlook of just how we deal with each other from a gender basis, understanding ourselves as women, men understanding themselves as men, and appreciating each other.
Thank you so much. I believe there's another question. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My question to you today, and also I must say before my question to say, I'm so thankful to be a part of this conference. I've learned so much. I really appreciate the invite, and I look forward to come to more conferences just like this one. My question to you today is...
Who are you directing your question to in particular, or everybody?
To the panel,
okay.
right.
All right.
Coming out of such rich conference and learning so much, are we going to leave it here? Or are we going to look to start something in each, I'm not going to say constituency, and then out of the, not constituency, parish. So for each parish would have probably, you know, a head office, and then we have branches in the different communities, because a lot of persons are suffering out there, you know, women going through, you know, a lot of things, and men also not understanding sometimes the reason why they do what they did. But if we have, you know, little meetings here and there, not just have it now and then afterwards they don't hear anything, but something constant to help to motivate these persons so that they can learn even more as to why not to do certain things that will hurt others and in turn hurt themselves. That we could correct it from the get-go so that we don't have anything to deal with in the later. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think if I make an attempt to just say, I think the question is answered by telling you, you're in it. You're in it. And this is one of the things that we are doing, bringing colleagues together to share, to learn, to exchange information, exchange ideas. And I believe we had this morning, in the earlier sessions, there was some discussions about the work that the Bureau was doing. Sharon, you had mentioned some of the work that the Bureau was doing. If you wanna just briefly address. Well, if you itemize it for me, if you can. Thank you. Just to talk about what some of the work that's been doing. Did we take all the mics? Yes, please. Here, Sharon, take this one for me, please. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. So, yes, I heard you and the lady before who spoke. So, what is happening today, and I'm sorry that our minister is not here, but I can't speak for her, but I have worked with her long enough to understand that she's big on involvement and engagement. And so your being here is no accident. You were carefully selected. And so the fact that you're here means you are already a part of this network. And we expect that you will continue to come to sessions like these and play your part. You heard me talk about the 4 A's, and it's not accident. Once it is that you are a part of what has happened today, it means that you will now become an extension of the support services that we provide through the Bureau of Gender Affairs, as well as something that is coming in terms of just improving the focus. I don't know if you've heard before that, you know, sometimes people say if you don't grab people, not necessarily physically, but if you don't get their attention, then they probably will not hear some of what is being said. So the fact that you're here means that now you have heard about this, because there are two CWPs. I don't know if you recognize. One is the Commonwealth for Women Parliamentarians, and the other CWP is a very new coinage for the Caucus of Women Parliamentarians, right? That's a local level. So the bigger one is a regional one, and then we have a Jamaican leg, which came out, that was a bicameral. It started off being a bicameral, meaning both houses, ladies, both sides of the house, you would have representation on this parliament, on this caucus from both sides. So you'd have the
both sides and both houses.
Both sides of, and both houses, the Senate and the Parliament, the lower house and the upper house. What has happened now is that has become a CWP, Caucus of Women Parliamentarians. And so the information that you're getting here today is going to be helping you to understand that this is not a group of women that just want to come and have talk shop. It's really a whole lot. In the conversations that you'd heard before, you would have heard some of the things that we want to do, and the Bureau is poised to support based on the fact that we are a part of that huge gender architecture I spoke about earlier. You wanted to know some of the programs that we do? Okay, so the one I mentioned earlier was the COPE. That's the Community Outreach through Partnership for Empowerment. And that essentially is a community outreach program that works with already existing community groups that are doing fantastic work but just needed some support. Either they needed a seed grant, or they needed leveraging, they needed some networking, they needed technical support, and something that will allow them to be larger and, you know, just to contribute a little more discreetly and to be seamless in whatever they do, and to perhaps meet some other persons and reach larger groups. So the seed grant that we give is a part of our budget, and we started that in 2016, 2019 rather, July 26, and every year we increase the numbers because there is a large group of persons who would need that support. So that's one, that's a COPE. And that COPE came out of the National Strategic Action Plan to eliminate gender-based violence in Jamaica. That is the comprehensive, coordinated national plan that has 5 strategic priority areas. The first area is prevention. The second one looks at protection. How do we protect vulnerable persons? Whether we put them in a shelter, we give them psychosocial counseling and support, we meet their needs in terms of a number of things that they need. So we have established national shelters. We have 2 up and running and 1 that's coming. The third area looks at reform of legislation. So some of what you heard today about the legislative process, that was very lengthy but very needed and required. How is it that when we have legislation, we ensure that it is not only implemented, but there's enforcement? And the most recent legislation that you heard as well is the one that just, well, it's 2 years ago that it was enacted. That's the Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act. And some of these ladies sitting here beside me were a part of the Joint Select Committee, and some of the ladies at that table were a part, and this table, a part of and at the head table, and we're a part of quite a few persons. We're a part of that Joint Select Committee. When you heard the Minister of Constitutional Affairs, Legal and Constitutional Affairs, when she spoke earlier, she talked about the lengthy process, and she also talked about the Joint Select Committee. That's a group that meets and has discussion around legislation and why it is that we want to make sure that the consultation is broad. Different groups will bring in their take on it, make their submissions, and we discuss it at length and pull out the things that we think are extremely pertinent to be a part of the legislation, whether it's new or it's going to be amended. Another activity is the GAP, Gender Ambassadors Program.
And I'm going to ask you to leave it at that, Sharon, as we try to wrap up.
All right,
this
thank
afternoon.
you. You don't want to start me up. So the GAP is Gender Ambassadors Program that is looking at how can we engage persons to be gender ambassadors. And we have that at 2 levels. We have the schools, and I'll stop there. We have the schools, and the schools, that's very special to me because I taught for 17 years, right? And so when I became a part of the gender portfolio, I wanted to see something that would show the nexus between gender and education, hence the GAP. And then we are going to have the other side to it, which is the persons like yourselves can be a part of that space, so you can listen out for the call, and when the call comes, please say yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so let me see. I'm going to take one more question. Yes, one more question. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone.
give her the mic as well, please, because we have people online. We didn't have any questions from the online people. No questions online.
Okay, I'm Mrs. Baker. I'm a counselor from the poorest division, which is a rural community, rural area. And this is a concern I have. And I appreciate this information. I'm happy I was late this morning because I totally forget, so I decided I'm coming anyway. And I'm happy I made it. But the question I have, how impactful as these organizations being in rural communities, how well do these promotions happen in the workforce, for example, in the police, in the army, the churches? My community.
When you said these organizations,
I heard you mention the gender equality among women, and what is happening to us as women out there in the workforce and all of that. Do we just focus here
You're talking
in the
about,
politics?
okay, so you're asking about policies in the rural level, or you're talking about particular organizations and their work?
In the rural level.
Which one?
Where I'm referring to the presentation that was done here today.
Okay.
And how well is it impacting on persons in the workforce? Is it only us in politics that the focus lies on? How well now will the community-based group, rural areas, be beneficiaries of what is happening here, or what has been happening in these areas here in Kingston? How will we bring this message to them? I know many times it depends on us as politicians, but many times we cannot find the resource persons to bring them into these rural communities.
Okay, well, let me lump that into a question that I was also formulating and throw that out both to Minister Balderramas Garcia and to Dr. Poyet. If you can give us your comments on the challenges in implementing legislation. So when you get to particularly in rural communities, which don't just reside in Jamaica, what are some of the barriers and the challenges that you see or have experienced in implementing legislation in those kinds of communities, and how have you overcome those? Can I start with Minister Garcia first?
I think the challenges, not only for rural communities, but the challenges overall would be in getting past the people who may give a pushback. And let me use the proposed equal opportunity legislation as an example, because there was a major pushback a couple of years ago in the previous administration. So I think that now in wheeling and coming again, as we would like to say, now I believe that in terms of all the communities, mainly we would have to engage with some of the more conservative or fundamentalist churches, if I could put it that way. No disrespect at all to all faith denominations, but I think we have to tailor the message a little bit more clearly to those church communities and faith organizations that would tend to be more conservative, and where we would get the pushback on teenagers accessing sexual and reproductive health care without parental permission, and also the perception that sometimes there are those who are pushing what we call the LGBT agenda, which is absolutely not the case with what the Belize government is now trying to do. So I think not so much rural, but of course, all the constituencies are pretty different, because in our southern communities, for example, we have more Maya people and Garifuna people. And out in the west, we have maybe more Spanish-speaking people. And so the tailoring of the message has to be in a form, first of all, that the people can understand in their own language. And then secondly, looking at how people receive messages and tailoring the message in a way that says to people, look, this is our own homegrown Belizean grassroots agenda, and not somebody pushing anything that is foreign. So I think, like I say, yes, the rural communities are very important, but I believe that we have to reach out using all our partners to the various communities as we find them, take our people as we find them, not try to preach, but to sit and come to an understanding. I'd just like to mention in very briefly that Belize is now undergoing constitutional reform. We have appointed a People's Constitutional Commission, and naturally the media are represented, the faith-based organizations are represented, and this is one of the ways that we can get people to sit down face to face, because the advocates of the LGBT community in the smaller non-governmental organizations are getting a chance to sit with some of the fundamental church people. And so they can look one another in the eye, they can exchange ideas, they can agree, they can say, okay, let's agree on what we can agree on. And then those things that may be a little bit more difficult, let's get to know one another better and respect one another as Belizean, so that we can pass the legislation that needs to be passed and adopt the policies that will make for a stronger, more inclusive, more equitable country.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Is Dr. Poyet still online? Would you like to give your remarks in relation to that question? Do we have Dr. Poyet? Poyet? No? Okay. I'm gonna take the opportunity then to thank our three presenters, Senator the Honorable Kamina Johnson-Smith, who had to leave before we ended for another engagement. I want to thank very much the Honorable Dolores Balderramos Garcia, Minister of Human Development, Families and Indigenous Peoples Affairs in Belize. Thank you, ma'am, for your contribution to this afternoon's session and to this conference. And the Honorable Dr. Virginia Albert Poyet, Minister for the Public Service, Home Affairs, Labor and Gender Affairs in St. Lucia. Thank you, ma'am, for your contributions this afternoon from the St. Lucian perspective. And I just want to reflect as I leave you on the point made by Dr. Poyet when she talked about budgeting in terms of the implementation of gender policy and gender legislation, and I want to share something with the room. About 4 years ago, I was involved as an attorney at law in a sexual assault case. It was a criminal case. My involvement at the time was to consider launching a civil claim for damages. It would interest you to know that at that time, just 4 years ago, nobody, no woman in Jamaica had ever filed a civil suit for damages for sexual assault. This is in the context, and I'll go further, I couldn't find where it had happened anywhere in the Caribbean. This is in the context, at the time, I believe it was the Bill Cosby case was on the radio, on the media. And we have seen a number of sexual assault, sexual harassment cases over the big international ones over the last 5 years. So when Senator Kamina Johnson-Smith talks about underreporting of harassment or underreporting of assault, gender neutral, when we talk about underreporting, understand what that might mean. Because if you're not even reporting the criminal aspect of it, it's much harder for you to walk into a civil court to mount a case. You then have to find an attorney, etc., etc. Those are normal barriers to getting into court on any matter. But it was mind-boggling to me that to this day, well, to that time, and I don't believe it has happened since, because I think I would have heard about it. It would have been the first one. And I just share the last thought that a very experienced businessman said to me when I gave him that statistics 4 years ago. And he said, until those who perpetrate sexual assault begin to feel it in their pockets, it will continue. Statement of a man. I thank you very much for your attention. I thank you for putting up with me. I apologize to you as well. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Senator. We're just reminding you to complete the conference questionnaire. I believe you have it in your email. So please take a few minutes to complete it. Yes, please. No, what happens when people go home, they forget about it, and they never remember it again. So, how was today? Great. We're very happy to hear that. I don't see the typing. Right, so this is, the questionnaire is a deliverable that the Parliament must give, so please take some time to give it in preparation for their next activity on this matter. So we've come to the end. I'm very happy that you enjoyed it. We're going to invite MP Tamika Davis to give us closing remarks.
What a wonderful day it has been. I remember at the outset, the mandate was to leave here feeling inspired, creating network, and I believe that at the end of today, we can all say that at the end of the day, we have really learned a whole heap of information. I listened to the counselor, where do we go from here? And the word is, you are a part of this network, and it is up to us, every individual in this room, to go forward with the information that you've garnered today to make a difference in the life of women in politics. The minister, Minister Grange, had to leave, and she was to do the vote of thanks. I have it here, and it's probably a good thing because I'm very sure in her 2-page vote of thanks, she did not mention her name. So I now have the opportunity of thanking her for her contribution to this conference. So I will now read the minister's vote of thanks. It is well known that all good things must come to an end, and today's conference was indeed a very good thing. And so, before we leave to continue our work on women in politics and parliamentary leadership, allow me to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you for joining us today at this remarkable conference on women's political and parliamentary leadership. We are delighted to have gathered here in beautiful Jamaica, renowned for its vibrant culture and its deep-rooted commitment to equality and empowerment. First and foremost, I would like to express my deepest appreciation to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the Commonwealth Women Parliamentarians for their partnership with my ministry and the Houses of Parliament to make today's conference a reality. This conference is a further signal of your unwavering support and commitment to advancing women's political and parliamentary leadership. Thank you. My heartfelt gratitude also goes to the distinguished speakers, panelists, session chairs who have shared their expertise and experiences during the insightful sessions. Special thanks to the visiting government ministers from other Caribbean territories who not only joined us, but also shared their experiences from their respective Caribbean territories. Your invaluable contributions have enlightened and motivated us, offering unique perspectives on the challenges and opportunities faced by women in political and parliamentary arenas. I am especially grateful that you have taken the time to use your own experiences to inspire leadership and drive change within political parties and parliaments across the region. Your passion and dedication to creating inclusive and equitable political systems are commendable, and we are grateful for the knowledge and wisdom you have shared today. I am grateful for the delegates and participants in attendance at this conference. Your active engagement, meaningful discussions, and exchange of ideas have undoubtedly enriched our collective understanding of women's leadership and the different experiences at varying levels of leadership. The diversity and range of experiences represented here reminds us of the strength that comes from unity and collaboration. By actively engaging in these discussions, you have taken a significant step towards creating a more inclusive and equitable future. We hope that the knowledge and connections gained during this conference will continue to empower you and inspire positive change in your respective communities. I would like to also express gratitude to my colleagues and members of staff from the Houses of Parliament, the staff at my ministry who have worked tirelessly to ensure the smooth running of this conference. We are grateful for your continued dedication and commitment to supporting my plans for gender-sensitive parliaments in Jamaica. While thanking my staff and the ministry, I would like to express my appreciation to Mr. Oliver Watt, Master of Ceremonies, for his smooth stewardship over today's program. In conclusion, I hope this conference reminds us of the larger global movement to empower women in politics, to empower women in parliaments, and how important each of us are in the larger movement. Let us seek to carry forward the spirit of this conference to champion the cause of women's political and parliamentary leadership and to work towards a world where women's voices are heard, valued, and represented at all levels of governance. Thank you once again to all the distinguished guests, speakers, participants, and supporters who have made this conference a success. Thank you, and may you continue to empower, inspire, and lead with a deep commitment of gender equality and women's empowerment, because together we can break down the barriers, shatter the glass ceilings, and create a future where women's political and parliamentary leadership is not only celebrated, but expected. Thank you.
Okay, that's it. Have a good afternoon. That's it. Remember to fill out the form. So please, the Parliament really needs the feedback. So if you can take a few minutes. All right. Drive safely. No.